And well you may be misreturned her maid, and make your mind quite easy that the willing deer is worked and worked away if those is Latin legs, exclaimed Miss Snipper, with strong feeling and allusion to Paul's give me English ones, I'm afraid he feels lonely and lost. Dr. Blimburn, Susan pursued Florence, turning away her face. I said Miss Snipper with great sharpness. So them Blimmers don't blame anyone, said Florence. It's a mistake, I say nothing about blame, Miss, cried Miss Snipper, for I know that you object, but I may wish, miss, that the family was set to work to make new roads, and that Miss Blimber went in front and had the pickaxe. After this speech, Miss Snipper, who was perfectly serious, wiped her eyes. I think I could perhaps give Paul some help, Susan, if I had these books, said Florence, and make the coming week a little easier to him. At least I want to try, so buy them for me, dear, and I will never forget how kind it was of you to do it. It must have been a harder heart than Susan Nippers that could have rejected the little purse Florence held out with these words, or the gentle look of entreaty with which she seconded her petition. Susan put the purse in her pocket without reply and trotted out at once upon her errand. The books were not easy to procure, and the answer at several shops was either that they were just out of them, or that they never kept them, or that they had had a great many last month, or that they expected a great many next week. But Susan was not easily baffled in such an enterprise, and having entrapped a white-haired youth in a black calico apron from a library where she was known to accompany her in her quest, she led him such a life in going up and down that he exerted himself to the utmost, if it were only to get rid of her, and finally enabled her to return home in triumph with these treasures. Then, after her own daily lessons were over, Florence sat down at night to track Paul's footsteps through the thorny ways of learning, and being possessed of a naturally quick and sound capacity, and taught by that most wonderful of masters, love, it was not long before she gained upon Paul's heels and caught and passed him. Not a word of this was breath to Mrs. Peepshin, but many a night when they were all in bed, and when Miss Snipper, with her hair in papers and herself asleep in some uncomfortable attitude, reposed unconscious by her side, and when the chinking ashes in the grate were cold and gray, and when the candles were burnt down and guttering out, Florence tried so hard to be a substitute for one small tomb that her fortitude and perseverance might have almost won her a free right to bear the name herself. And high was her reward when one Saturday evening, as little Paul was sitting down as usual to resume his studies, she sat down by his side and showed him all that was so rough made smooth, and all that was so dark made clear and plain before him. It was nothing but a startled look in Paul's wan face, a flush, a smile, and then a close embrace. But God knows how her heart leapt up at this rich payment for her trouble. "Oh, Floy," cried her brother, how I love you, Floy, and I you dear, oh, I am sure of that, Floy." He said no more about it, but all that evening sat close by her, very quiet, and in the night he called out from his little room within hers 3 or 4 times that he loved her regularly. After that, Florence was prepared to sit down with Paul on Saturday night and patiently assist him through so much as they could anticipate together of his next week's work. The cheering thought that he was laboring on where Florence had just toiled before him would of itself have been a stimulant to Paul in the perpetual resumption of his studies, but coupled with the actual lightening of his load consequent on this assistance, it saved him possibly from sinking underneath the burden which the fair Cornelia Blimber piled upon his back. It was not that Miss Blimber meant to be too hard upon him, or that Dr. Blimber meant to bear too heavily on the young gentleman in general. Cornelia merely held the faith in which she had been bred, and the doctor, in some partial confusion of his ideas, regarded the young gentlemen as if they were all doctors, and were born grown up, comforted by the applause of the young gentleman's nearest relations, and urged on by their blind vanity and ill-considered haste. It would have been strange if Dr. Blimber had discovered his mistake or trimmed his swelling sails to any other tack. Thus in the case of Paul, when Dr. Blimber said he made great progress and was naturally clever, Mr. Dombey was more bent than ever on his being forced and crammed. In the case of Briggs, when Dr. Blimber reported that he did not make great progress yet and was not naturally clever, Briggs Sr. was inexorable in the same purpose. In short, however high and false the temperature at which the doctor kept his hot house, the owners of the plants were always ready to lend a helping hand at the bellows and to stir the fire. Such spirits as he had in the outset Paul soon lost, of course, but he retained all that was strange and old and thoughtful in his character, and under circumstances so favorable to the development of those tendencies, became even more strange and old and thoughtful than before. The only difference was that he kept his character to himself. He grew more thoughtful and reserved every day and had no such curiosity in any living member of the doctor's household as he had in Mrs. Peepkin. He loved to be alone, and in those short intervals, when he was not occupied with his books, liked nothing so well as wandering about the house by himself, or sitting on the stairs listening to the great clock in the hall. He was intimate with all the paper hanging in the house, saw things that no one else saw in the patterns, found out miniature tigers and lions running up the bedroom walls and squinting faces leering in the squares and diamonds of the floor cloth the solitary child lived on, surrounded by this arabesque work of his musing fancy. And no one understood him. Mrs. Bleember thought him odd, and sometimes the servants said among themselves that little Dombey mooped, but that was all unless young Toots had some idea on the subject, to the expression of which he was wholly unequal. Ideas like ghosts, according to the common notion of ghosts, must be spoken to a little before they will explain themselves, and Toots had long left off asking any questions of his own mind. Some mist, they may have been, issuing from that leaden casket, his cranium, which if it could have taken shape and form would have become a genie. But it could not, and it only so far followed the example of the smoke in the Arabian story as to roll out in a thick cloud, and there hang and hover, but it left a little figure visible upon a lonely shore, and Toots was always staring at it. "How are you?" he would say to Paul 50 times a day. "Quite well, sir, thank you," Paul would answer. "Shake hands," would be Tootsy's next advance, which Paul of course would immediately do. "Mr. Toot generally said again, after a long interval of staring and hard breathing, "How are you?" to which Paul again replied, "Quite well, sir, thank you." One evening Mr. Toots was sitting at his desk oppressed by correspondence, when a great purpose seemed to flash upon him. He laid down his pen and went off to seek Paul, whom he found at last after a long search looking through the window of his little bedroom. "I say," cried Toad, speaking the moment he entered the room, lest he should forget it, "what do you think about?" "Oh, I think about a great many things," replied Paul. "Do you though?" said Toots, appearing to consider that fact in itself surprising. "If you had to die," said Paul, looking up into his face. Mr. Toots started and seemed much disturbed. "Don't you think you would rather die on a moonlit night when the sky was quite clear, and the wind blowing as it did last night?" Mr. Toots said, looking doubtfully at Paul, and shaking his head, "that he didn't know about that. Not blowing at least," said Paul, "but sounding in the air, like the sea sounds in the shells. It was a beautiful night. When I had listened to the water for a long time, I got up and looked out. There was a boat over there in the full light of the moon, a boat with a sail." The child looked at him so steadfastly and spoke so earnestly that Mr. Toots, feeling himself called upon to say something about this boat, said "smugglers," but with an impartial remembrance of there being two sides to every question, he added, "all preventive." "A boat with a sail," repeated Paul. "In the full light of the moon, the sail like an arm, all silver. It went away into the distance. And what do you think it seemed to do as it moved with the waves?" "Pitch," said Mr. Toots. "It seemed to beckon," said the child, "to beckon me to come there. She is there. She is." Toots was almost beside himself with dismay at this sudden exclamation, after what had gone before, and cried, "Who?" "My sister Florence," cried Paul, looking up here and waving her hand. "She sees me, she sees me. Good night, dear." "Good night, good night." His quick transition to a state of unbounded pleasure as he stood at his window kissing and clapping his hands, and the way in which the light retreated from his features as she passed out of his view and left a patient melancholy on the little face, were too remarkable wholly to escape even Toots's notice, their interview being interrupted at this moment by a visit from Mrs. Peepkin, who usually brought her black skirts to bed upon Paul just before dusk once or twice a week. Toots had no opportunity of improving the occasion, but it left so marked an impression on his mind that he twice returned, after having exchanged the usual salutations, to ask Mrs. Peepkin how she did this. The irascible lady conceived to be a deeply devised and long meditated insult originating in the diabolical invention of the weak-eyed young man downstairs, against whom she accordingly lodged a formal complaint with Dr. Bleember that very night, who mentioned to the young man that If he ever did it again, he should be obliged to part with him, the evenings being longer now. Paul stole up to his window every evening to look out for Florence. She always passed and repassed at a certain time until she saw him, and their mutual recognition was a gleam of sunshine in Paul's daily life. Often after dark, one other figure walked alone before the doctor's house. He rarely joined them on the Saturdays. Now he could not bear it. He would rather come unrecognized and look up at the windows where his son was qualifying for a man and wait and watch and plan. And hope, oh, could he but have seen, or seen as others did, the slight spare boy above, watching the waves and clouds at twilight with his earnest eyes, and breasting the window of his solitary cage when birds flew by, as if he would have emulated them and soared away. Chapter 13. Shipping intelligence and office business. Mr. Dobby's offices were in a court where there was an old established stall of choice fruit at the corner, where perambulating merchants of both sexes offered for sale at any time between the hours of 10 and 5 slippers, pocketbooks, sponges, dog collars, and Windsor soap, and sometimes a pointer or an oil painting. The point always came that way with a view to the stock exchange, where a sporting taste originating generally in bets of new hats is much in vogue. The other commodities were addressed to the general public, but they were never offered by the vendors to Mr. Dombey. When he appeared, the dealers in those wares fell off respectfully. The principal slipper and dog's collar man, who considered himself a public character and whose portrait was screwed onto an artist's door in Cheapside, threw up his forefinger to the brim of his hat as Mr. Dombey went by. The ticket porter, if he were not absent on a job, always ran officiously before to open Mr. Dombey's office door as wide as possible and hold it open with his hat off while he entered. The clerks within were not a whit behindhand in their demonstrations of respect. A solemn hush prevailed as Mr. Dombey passed through the outer office. The wit of the counting house became in a moment as mute as the row of leathern fire buckets hanging up behind him. Such vapid and flat daylight as filtered through the ground glass windows and skylights, leaving a black sediment upon the panes, showed the books and papers, and the figures bending over them enveloped in a studious gloom, and as much obstructed in appearance from the world without as if they were assembled at the bottom of the sea, while moldy little strong room in the obscure perspective, where a shaded lamp was always burning, might have represented the cavern of some ocean monster looking on with a red eye at these mysteries of the deep. When perched the messenger, whose place was on a little bracket like a timepiece, saw Mr. Dombey come in, or rather, when he felt that he was coming, for he had usually an instinctive sense of his approach, he hurried into Mr. Dombey's room, stirred the fire, carried fresh coals from the bowels of the coal box, hung the newspaper to air upon the fender, put the chair ready and the screen in its place, and was round upon his heel on the instant of Mr. Dombey's entrance to take his great coat and hat and hang them up. Then Perch took the newspaper and gave it a turn or two in his hands before the fire and laid it deferentially at Mr. Dombey's elbow, and so little objection had Perch to being deferential in the last degree that if he might have laid himself at Mr. Dombey's feet, or might have called him by some such title as used to be bestowed upon the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, he would have been all the better pleased, as this honor would have been an innovation and an experiment. Perch was fain to content himself by expressing as well as he could in his manner, "You are the light of my eyes, you are the breath of my soul, you are the commander of the faithful." Perch, with this imperfect happiness to cheer him, he would shut the door softly, walk away on tiptoe, and leave his great chief to be stared at through a dome-shaped window in the leads by ugly chimney pots and backs of houses, and especially by the bold window of a hair-cutting saloon on a first floor, where a waxen effigy, bald as a muscle man in the morning and covered after 11 o'clock in the day with luxuriant hair and whiskers in the latest Christian fashion, showed him the wrong side of its head forever between Mr. Dombey and the common world, as it was accessible through the medium of the outer office, to which Mr. Dombey's presence in his own room may be said to have struck like damp or cold air. There were 2 degrees of descent. Mr. Karka in his own office was the first step. Mr. Morphine in his own office was the second. Each of these gentlemen occupied a little chamber, like a bathroom, opening from the passage outside Mr. Dombey's door. Mr. Karka, as Grand Vizier, inhabited the room that was nearest to the Sultan. Mr. Morphine, as an officer of inferior state, inhabited the room that was nearest to the clerks. The gentleman last mentioned was a cheerful-looking, hazel-eyed, elderly bachelor, gravely attired as to his upper man in black, and as to his legs in pepper and salt color. His dark hair was just touched here and there with specks of gray, as though the tread of time had splashed it, and his whiskers were already white. He had a mighty respect for Mr. Dobby and rendered him due homage. But as he was of a genial temper himself, and never wholly at ease in that stately presence, he was disquieted by no jealousy of the many conferences enjoyed by Mr. Carca, and felt a secret satisfaction in having duties to discharge which rarely exposed him to be singled out for such distinction. He was a great musical amateur in his way after business, and had a paternal affect for the violoncello, which was once in every week transported from Islington, his place of abode, to a certain club room hard by the bank, where quartets of the most tormenting and excruciating nature were executed every Wednesday evening by a private party. Mr. Carca was a gentleman, 38 or 40 years old, of a florid complexion, and with two unbroken rows of glistening teeth whose regularity and whiteness were quite distressing. It was impossible to escape the observation of them, for he showed them whenever he spoke, and bore so wide a smile upon his countenance, a smile, however, very rarely indeed extending beyond his mouth, that there was something in it like the snarl of a cat. He affected a stiff white cravat after the example of his principal, and was always closely buttoned up and tightly dressed. His manner toward Mr. Dobby was deeply conceived and perfectly expressed. He was familiar with him in the very extremity of his sense of the distance between them. Mr. Dombey, to a man in your position, from a man in mine, there is no show of subservience compatible with the transaction of business between us that I should think sufficient. I frankly tell you, sir, I give it up altogether. I feel that I could not satisfy my own mind, and heaven knows, Mr. Dobby, you can afford to dispense with the endeavor. If he had carried these words about with him printed on a placard, and had constantly offered it to Mr. Dobby's perusal on the breast of his coat, he could not have been more explicit than he was. This was Carca, the manager. Mr. Carca, the junior Walter's friend, was his brother, 2 or 3 years older than he, but widely removed in station. The younger brother's post was on the top of the official ladder, the elder brother's at the bottom. The elder brother never gained a stave, or raised his foot to mount one. Young men passed above his head and rose, but he was always at the bottom. He was quite resigned to occupy that low condition, never complained of it, and certainly never hoped to escape from it. How do you do this morning? Said Mr. Parker, the manager, entering Mr. Dobby's room soon after his arrival one day with a bundle of papers in his hand. How do you do, Parker? Said Mr. Dobby. Coolish, observed Mr. Carrara, stirring the fire. Rather, said Mr. Dombey. Any news of the young gentleman who is so important to us all? Asked Parker, with his whole regiment of teeth on parade. Yes, not direct news. I hear he's very well, said Mr. Dombey, who had come from Brighton overnight, but no one knew it very well, and becoming a great scholar. No doubt, observed the manager. I hope so, returned Mr. Dobby. Egad, said Mr. Carr, shaking his head. Time flies. I think so sometimes, returned Mr. Dombey, glancing at his newspaper. You have no reason to think so, observed Carca. One who sits on such an elevation as yours, and can sit there unmoved in all seasons, hasn't much reason to know anything about the flight of time. It's men like myself who are low down, and are not superior in circumstances, and who inherit new masters in the course of time, that have cause to look about us. I shall have a rising sun to worship soon. Time enough, Carca, said Mr. Dombey, rising from his chair and standing with his back to the fire. Have you anything there for me? I don't know that I need trouble you, returned Parker, turning over the papers in his hand. You have a committee today at 3, you know, and one at 3:75, added Mr. Dombey. Catch you forgetting anything, exclaimed Carca, still turning over his papers. If Mr. Paul inherits your memory, he'll be a troublesome customer in the house. One of you is enough. You have an accurate memory of your own, said Mr. Dombey. Oh, I, returned the manager. It's the only capital of a man like me. Mr. Dombey did not look less pompous or at all displeased as he stood leaning against the chimney piece, surveying his, of course, unconscious clerk from head to foot. The stiffness and nicety of Mr. Parker's dress, and a certain arrogance of manner, either natural to him or imitated from a pattern not far off, gave great additional effect to his humility. He seemed a man who would contend against the power that vanquished him if he could, but who was utterly borne down by "The greatness and superiority of Mr. Dombey is morphine here?" asked Mr. Dombey after a short pause, during which Mr. Parker had been fluttering his papers and muttering little abstracts of their contents to himself. "Morphine's here," he answered, looking up with his widest and almost sudden smile, humming musical recollections of his last night's quartet party, "I suppose, through the walls between us and driving me half mad. I wish he'd make a bonfire of his violin and cello and burn his music books in it. You respect nobody, Carker, I think," said Mr. Dombey. "No," inquired Carker with another wide and most feline show of his teeth. "Well, not many people, I believe. I wouldn't answer, perhaps," he murmured, as if he were only thinking it for more than one. "A dangerous quality, if real, and a not less dangerous one if feigned." But Mr. Dombey hardly seemed to think so, as he still stood with his back to the fire, drawn up to his full height, and looking at his head clerk with a dignified composure in which there seemed to lurk a stronger latent sense of power than usual. "Talking of morphine," resumed Mr. Parker, taking out one paper from the rest, "he reports a junior dead in the agency at Barbados and proposes to reserve a passage in the Sun and Air. She sail in a month or so for the successor. You don't care who goes, I suppose?" "We have nobody of that sort here." Mr. Dombey shook his head with supreme indifference. "It's no very precious appointment," observed Mr. Carker, taking up a pen with which to endorse a memorandum on the back of the paper. "I hope he may bestow it on some orphan nephew of a musical friend. It may perhaps stop his fiddle playing if he has a gift that way. Who's that? Come in, I beg." "Your pardon, Mr. Carker, I didn't know you were here, sir," answered Walter, appearing with some letters in his hand, unopened and newly arrived. "Mr. Parker the junior, sir." At the mention of this name, Mr. Parker the manager was, or affected to be, touched to the quick with shame and humiliation. He cast his eyes full on Mr. Dombey with an altered and apologetic look, abased them on the ground, and remained for a moment without speaking. "I thought, sir," he said suddenly and angrily, turning on Walter, "that you had been before requested not to drag Mr. Parker the junior into your conversation." "I beg your pardon," returned Walter. "I was only going to say that Mr. Carker the junior had told me he believed you were gone out, or I should not have knocked at the door when you were engaged with Mr. Dombey. These are letters from Mr. Dombey, sir." "Very well, sir," returned Mr. Parker the manager, plucking them sharply from his hand. "Go about your business." But in taking them with so little ceremony, Mr. Carker dropped one on the floor and did not see what he had done. Neither did Mr. Dombey observe the letter lying near his feet. Walter hesitated for a moment, thinking that one or other of them would notice it, but finding that neither did, he stopped, came back, picked it up, and laid it himself on Mr. Dombey's desk. The letters were post letters, and it happened that the one in question was Mrs. Pipkin's regular report, directed as usual for Mrs. Pipkin, was but an indifferent penwoman by Florence. Mr. Dombey, having his attention silently called to this letter by Walter, started and looked fiercely at him, as if he believed that he had purposely selected it from all the rest. "You can leave the room, sir," said Mr. Dombey haughtily. He crushed the letter in his hand, and having watched Walter out of the door, put it in his pocket without breaking the seal. These continual references to Mr. Parker the junior, Mr. Parker the manager, began as soon as they were alone, "are to a man in my position uttered before one in yours so unspeakably distressing." "Nonsense, Carker," Mr. Dombey interrupted. "You are too sensitive." "I am sensitive," he returned. "If one in your position could by any possibility imagine yourself in my place, which you cannot, you would be so too." As Mr. Dombey's thoughts were evidently pursuing some other subject, his discreet ally broke off here and stood with his teeth ready to present to him when he should look up. "You want somebody to send to the West Indies, you were saying," observed Mr. Dombey hurriedly. "Yes," replied Kaka, "send young gay." "Good, very good indeed. Nothing easier," said Mr. Parker without any show of surprise, and taking up the pen to re-endorse the letter as coolly as he had done before. "Send young gay, call him back," said Mr. Dombey. Mr. Carker was quick to do so, and Walter was quick to return. "Gay," said Mr. Dombey, turning a little to look at him over his shoulder. "Here is an opening," said Mr. Carker, with his mouth stretched to the utmost, "in the West Indies at Barbados. I am going to send you," said Mr. Dombey scornfully, embellishing the bare truth, "to fill a junior situation in the counting house at Barbados. Let your uncle know from me that I have chosen you to go to the West Indies." Walter's breath was so completely taken away by his astonishment that he could hardly find enough for the repetition of the words West Indies. "Somebody must go," said Mr. Danby. "And you are young and healthy, and your uncle's circumstances are not good. Tell your uncle that you are appointed. He will not go yet. There will be an interval of a month or two perhaps." "Shall I remain there, sir?" inquired Walter. "Will you?" "Remain there, sir," repeated Mr. Danby, turning a little more round towards him. "What do you mean? What does he mean?" "Cocker live there, sir," faltered Walter. "Certainly," returned Mr. Danby. Walter bowed. "That's all," said Mr. Danby, resuming his letters. "You will explain to him in good time about the usual outfit, and so forth." "Cocker, of course. He needn't wait." "Cocker, you needn't wait, Gay," observed Mr. Cocker, bare to the gums, unless Mr. Danby, stopping in his reading, without looking off the letter and seeming to listen, "unless he has anything to say." "No, sir," returned Walter, agitated and confused and almost stunned, as an infinite variety of pictures presented themselves to his mind, among which Captain Cuttle in his glazed hat transfixed with astonishment at Mrs. McStinger's, and his uncle bemoaning his loss in the little back parlor held prominent places. "I hardly know. I am much obliged, sir. He needn't wait, Carter," said Mr. Danby, and as Mr. Cocker again echoed the words and also collected his papers, as if he were going away, Walter felt that his lingering any longer would be an unpardonable intrusion, especially as he had nothing to say, and therefore walked out quite confounded. Going along the passage with the mingled consciousness and helplessness of a dream, he heard Mr. Danby's door shut again as Mr. Carr came out, and immediately afterwards that gentleman called to him, "Bring your friend Mr. Parker the Jr. to my room, sir, if you please." Walter went to the outer office and apprised Mr. Parker the Jr. of his errand, who accordingly came out from behind a partition, where he sat alone in one corner, and returned with him to the room of Mr. Parker the manager. That gentleman was standing with his back to the fire, and his hands under his coat-tails, looking over his white cravat as unpromisingly as Mr. Danby himself could have looked. He received them without any change in his attitude or softening of his harsh and black expression, merely signing to Walter to close the door. "John Carr," said the manager, when this was done, turning suddenly upon his brother, with his two rows of teeth bristling, as if he would have bitten him, "what is the league between you and this young man, in virtue of which I am haunted and hunted by the mention of your name? Is it not enough for you, John Carter, that I am your near relation, and can't detach myself from that?" "Say disgrace, James," interposed the other in a low voice. Finding that he stammered for a word, "You mean it, and have reason. Say disgrace." "From that disgrace," assented his brother with keen emphasis. "But is the fact to be blurted out and trumpeted and proclaimed continually in the presence of the very house, in moments of confidence? Do you think your name is calculated to harmonize in this place with trust and confidence?" "John Carter, no," returned the other. "No, James, God knows I have no such thought." "What is your thought then?" said his brother. "And why do you thrust yourself in my way? Haven't you injured me enough already?" "I have never injured you, James, willfully. You are my brother," said the manager. "That's injury enough. I wish I could undo it, James. I wish you could." And would. During this conversation, Walter had looked from one brother to the other with pain and amazement. He who was the senior in years and junior in the house stood with his eyes cast upon the ground and his head bowed, humbly listening to the reproaches of the other, though these were rendered very bitter by the tone and look with which they were accompanied, and by the presence of Walter, whom they so much surprised and shocked. He ended no other protest against them than by slightly raising his right hand in a deprecatory manner, as if he would have said, "Spare me." So had there been blows, and he a brave man and a strong constraint, and weakened by bodily suffering, he might have stood before the executioner generous and quick in all his emotions, and regarding himself as the innocent occasion of these taunts. Walter now struck in with all the earnestness he felt. "Mr. Carker," he said, addressing himself to the manager, indeed, this is my fault, solely in a kind of heedlessness, for which I cannot blame myself enough. I have no doubt mentioned Mr. Parker the Jr. much oftener than was necessary, and have allowed his name sometimes to slip through my lips when it was against your expressed wish, but it has been my mistake. Sir, we have never exchanged one word upon the subject, very few indeed on any subject, and it has not been," added Walter, after a moment's pause, "all heedlessness on my part, sir, for I have felt an interest in Mr. Parker ever since I have been here, and have hardly been able to help speaking of him sometimes when I have thought of him so much. Walter said this from his soul, and with the very breath of honor, for he looked upon that bowed head, and the downcast eyes and upraised hand, and thought, I have felt it, and why should I not avow it in behalf of this unfriended, broken man? Mr. Carker, the manager, looked at him as he spoke, and when he had finished speaking, with a smile that seemed to divide his face into two parts, "You are an excitable youth, Gay," he said, "and should endeavor to cool down a little now, for it would be unwise to encourage feverish predispositions. Be as cool as you can, Gay, be as cool as you can." You might have asked Mr. John Parker himself, if you have not done so, whether he claims to be or is an object of such strong interest. "James, do me justice," said his brother. "I have claimed nothing, and I claim nothing, believe me, on my honor," said his brother with another smile as he warmed himself before the fire. "On my life, on my fallen life," returned the other in the same low voice, but with a deeper stress on his words than he had yet seemed capable of giving them. "Believe me, I have held myself aloof and kept alone. This has been unsorted by me. I have avoided him and everyone." "Indeed, you have avoided me, Mr. Carker," said Walter, with the tears rising to his eyes. "So true is his compassion. I know it to my disappointment and regret. When I first came here, and ever since, I am sure I have tried to be as much your friend as one of my age could presume to be. But it has been of no use." "And observe," said the manager, taking him up quickly, "it will be of still less use, Gay, if you persist in forcing Mr. John Carr's name on people's attention. That is not the way to befriend Mr. John Carr. Ask him. If he thinks it is no service to me," said the brother. "It only leads to such a conversation as the present, which I need not say I could have well spared. No one can be a better friend to me." He spoke here very distinctly, as if he would impress it upon Walter, "than in forgetting me, and leaving me to go my way unquestioned and unnoticed. Your memory not being retentive, Gay, of what you are told by others," said Mr. Parker, the manager, warming himself with great and increased satisfaction. "I thought it well that you should be told this from the best authority," nodding towards his brother. "You are not likely to forget it now. I hope that's all, Gay. You can go." Walter passed out at the door and was about to close it after him when, hearing the voices of the brothers again, and also the mention of his own name, he stood irresolutely with his hand upon the lock and the door ajar, uncertain whether to return or go away. In this position he could not help overhearing what followed. "Think of me more leniently, if you can, James," said John Cocker, "when I tell you I have had, how could I help having, with my history written here," striking himself upon the breast, "my whole heart awakened by my observation of that boy Walter Gay. I saw in him, when he first came here, almost my other self." "Your other self," repeated the manager disdainfully. "Not as I am, but as I was when I first came here, too, as sanguine, giddy, youthful, inexperienced, flushed with the same restless and adventurous fancies, and full of the same qualities, fraught with the same capacity of leading on to good or evil." "I hope not," said his brother with some hidden and sarcastic meaning in his tone. "You strike me sharply, and your hand is steady, and your thrust is very deep," returned the other, speaking or so. Walter thought as if some cruel weapon actually stabbed him as he spoke. "I imagined all this when he was a boy. I believed it was a truth, too. Me, I saw him lightly walking on the edge of an unseen gulf, where so many others walk with equal gaiety, and from which the old excuse," interrupted his brother as he stirred the fire. "So many go on, say, so many fall, from which one traveler fell," returned the other, who set forward on his way, a boy like him, and missed his footing more and more, and slipped a little and a little lower, and went on stumbling still, until he fell headlong, and found himself below, a shattered man. Think what I suffered when I watched that boy." "You have only yourself to thank for it," returned the brother. "Only myself," he assented with a sigh. "I don't seek to divide the blame or shame. You have divided the shame," James Carleton muttered through his teeth, "and through so many, and such close teeth," he could mutter well. "Ah, James," returned his brother, speaking for the first time in an accent of reproach, and seeming by the sound of his voice to have covered his face with his hands, "I have been since then a useful foil to you. You have trodden on me freely in your climbing up. Don't spurn me with your heel." A silence ensued. After a time, Mr. Parker, the manager, was heard rustling among his papers, as if he had resolved to bring the interview to a conclusion. At the same time, his brother withdrew nearer to the door. "That's all," he said. "I watched him with such trembling and such fear, as was some little punishment to me, until he passed the place where I first fell, and then, though I had been his father, I Believe I never could have thanked God more devoutly. I didn't dare to warn him and advise him. But if I had seen direct cause, I would have shown him my example. I was afraid to be seen speaking with him, lest it should be thought I did him harm and tempted him to evil and corrupted him, or lest I really should. There may be such contagion in me, I don't know. Piece out my history and connection with young Walter Gay and what he has made me feel, and think of me more leniently, James, if you can." With these words, he came out to where Walter was standing. He turned a little paler when he saw him there, and paler yet when Walter caught him by the hand and said in a whisper, "Mr. Carker, pray let me thank you. Let me say how much I feel for you, how sorry I am to have been the unhappy cause of all this, how I almost look upon you now as my protector and guardian, how very, very much I feel obliged to you and pity you," said Walter, squeezing both his hands and hardly knowing in his agitation what he did or said. Mr. Morfin's room being close at hand and empty, and the door wide open, they moved thither by one accord, the passage being seldom free from someone passing to or fro when they were there, and Walter saw in Mr. Cocker's face some traces of the emotion within. He almost felt as if he had never seen the face before, it was so greatly changed. "Walter," he said, laying his hand on his shoulder, "I am far removed from you, and may I ever be. Do you know what I am? What you are?" appeared to hang on Walter's lips as he regarded him attentively. "It was begun," said Carter, "before my 21st birthday, LED up to long before, but not begun till near that time. I had robbed them. When I came of age, I robbed them afterwards. Before my 22nd birthday, it was all found out. And then, Walter, from all men's society I died again." His last few words hung trembling upon Walter's lips, but he could neither utter them nor any of his own. "The house was very good to me. May heaven reward the old man for his forbearance." This one to his son, who was then newly in the firm where I had held great trust. "I was called into that room, which is now his. I have never entered it since, and came out what you know me for many years. I sat in my present seat alone, as now, but then unknown, and recognized example to the rest. They were all merciful to me, and I lived. Time has altered that part of my poor expiation, and I think except the three heads of the house there is no one here who knows my story rightly. Before the little boy grows up and has it told to him, my corner may be vacant. I would rather that it might be so. This is the only change to me since that day when I left all youth and hope and good men's company behind me in that room. God bless you, Walter, keep you and all dear to you in honesty, or strike them dead." Some recollection of his trembling from head to foot as if with excessive cold, and of his bursting into tears, was all that Walter could add to this. When he tried to recall exactly what had passed between them, when Walter saw him next, he was bending over his desk in his old silent, drooping, humbled way. Then observing him at his work and feeling how resolved he evidently was that no further intercourse should arise between them, and thinking again and again on all he had seen and heard that morning in so short a time, in connection with the history of both the Caucasus, Walter could hardly believe that he was under orders for the West Indies and would soon be lost to Uncle Saul and Captain Cuttle, and to glimpses few and far between of Florence Dombey. No, he meant Paul, and to all he loved and liked and looked for in his daily life. But it was true, and the news had already penetrated to the outer office. For while he sat with a heavy heart pondering on these things and resting his head upon his arm perch, the messenger descending from his mahogany bracket and jogging his elbow begged his pardon, but wished to say in his ear did he think he could arrange to send home to England a jar of preserved ginger, cheap for Mrs. Perch's own eating in the course of her recovery from her next confinement. Chapter 14. Hall grows more and more old-fashioned and goes home for the holidays. When the midsummer vacation approached, no indecent manifestations of joy were exhibited by the leaden-eyed young gentlemen assembled at Dr. Blimber's. Any such violent expression as breaking up would have been quite inapplicable to that polite establishment. The young gentlemen oozed away semi-annually to their own homes, but they never broke up. They would have scorned the action Tozer, who was constantly galled and tormented by a starched white cambric neckcloth, which he wore at the express desire of Mrs. Tozer, his parent, who, designing him for the church, was of opinion that he couldn't be in that forward state of preparation too soon. Tozer said, indeed, that choosing between two evils, he thought he would rather Stay where he was, then go home. However inconsistent this declaration might appear, with that passage in Tosa's essay on the subject wherein he had observed that the thoughts of home and all its recollections awakened in his mind the most pleasing emotions of anticipation and delight, and had also likened himself to a Roman general flushed with a recent victory over the Iceni, or laden with Carthaginian spoil, advancing within a few hours' march of the capital presupposed for the purposes of the simile to be the dwelling place of Mrs. Tozer. Still, it was very sincerely made, for it seemed that Tosa had a dreadful uncle who not only volunteered examinations of him in the holidays on abstruse points, but twisted innocent events and things and wrenched them to the same fell purpose, so that if this uncle took him to the play, or on a similar pretense of kindness carried him to see a giant or a dwarf or a conjurer, or anything, Tozer knew he had read up some classical allusion to that subject beforehand, and was thrown into a state of mortal apprehension, not foreseeing where he might break out or what authority he might not quote against him. As to Briggs, his father made no show of artifice about it. He never would leave him alone. So numerous and severe were the mental trials of that unfortunate youth in vacation time, that the friends of the family, then resident near Bayswater, London, seldom approached the ornamental piece of water in Kensington Gardens without a vague expectation of seeing Master Briggs's hat floating on the surface, and an unfinished exercise lying on the bank. Briggs therefore was not at all sanguine on the subject of holidays, and these two sharers of little Paul's bedroom were so fair a sample of the young gentleman and general that the most elastic among them contemplated the arrival of these festive periods with genteel resignation. It was far otherwise with little Paul. The end of these first holidays was to witness his separation from Florence, but whoever looked forward to the end of holidays whose beginning was not yet come? Not Paul, assuredly. As the happy time drew near, the lions and tigers climbing up the bedroom walls became quite tame and frolicsome. The grim sly faces in the squares and diamonds of the floor cloth relaxed and peeped out at him with less wicked eyes. The grave old clock had more of a personal interest in the tone of its formal inquiry, and the restless sea went rolling on all night to the sound of a melancholy strain. Yet it was pleasant too, that rose and fell with the waves and rocked him as it were to sleep. Mr. Feederby seemed to think that he too would enjoy the holidays very much. Mr. Toots projected a life of holidays from that time forth, for, as he regularly informed Paul every day, it was his last half at Dr. Bleember's, and he was going to begin to come into his property directly. It was perfectly understood between Paul and Mr. Toots that they were intimate friends, notwithstanding their distance in point of years and station. As the vacation approached, and Mr. Toots breathed harder and stared oftener in Paul's society than he had done before, Paul knew that he meant he was sorry they were going to lose sight of each other, and felt very much obliged to him for his patronage and good opinion. It was even understood by Dr. Bleember, Mrs. Bleember, and Miss Bleember, as well as by the young gentlemen in general, that Toots had somehow constituted himself protector and guardian of Dobby, and the circumstance becoming so notorious even to Mrs. Peepchin, that the good old creature cherished feelings of bitterness and jealousy against Toots, and in the sanctuary of her own home repeatedly denounced him as a chuckle-headed noodle, whereas the innocent Toots had no more idea of awakening Mrs. Pipkin's wrath than he had of any other definite possibility or proposition. On the contrary, he was disposed to consider her rather a remarkable character, with many points of interest about her. For this reason, he smiled on her with so much urbanity, and asked her how she did so often in the course of her visits to little Paul, that at last she one night told him plainly she wasn't used to it, whatever he might think, and she could not, and she would not bear it either from himself or any other puppy then existing. At which unexpected acknowledgement of his civilities, Mr. Toots was so alarmed that he secreted himself in a retired spot until she had gone, nor did he ever again face the doughty Mrs. Peepchin under Dr. Bleember's roof. They were within 2 or 3 weeks of the holidays, when one day Cornelia Bleember called Paul into her room and said, "Dombey, I'm going to send home your analysis." "Thank you, ma'am," returned Paul. "You know what I mean, do you?" "Dombey," inquired Miss Bleember, looking hard at him through the spectacles. "No, ma'am," said Paul. Don't be," said Miss Bleember. "I begin to be afraid you are a sad boy when you don't know the meaning of an expression. Why don't you seek for information?" "Mrs. Pipkin told me I wasn't to ask questions," returned Paul, I must beg you not to mention Mrs. Pipkin to me on any account, Dobby," returned Miss Bleember. "I couldn't think of allowing it. The course of study here is far removed from anything of that sort. A repetition of such allusions would make it necessary for me to request to hear without a mistake before breakfast time. Tomorrow morning from verbum personalia down to simillimicino." "I didn't mean, ma'am," began little Paul. "I must trouble you not to tell me that you didn't mean, if you please, Dombey," said Miss Bleember, who preserved an awful politeness in her admonitions. "That is a line of argument I couldn't dream of permitting." Paul felt it safest to say nothing at all, so he only looked at Miss Bleember's spectacles. Miss Bleember, having shaken her head at him, gravely referred to a paper lying before her. "Analysis of the character of P. Tambay, if my recollection serves me," said Miss Bleember, breaking off the word analysis, "as opposed to synthesis, is thus defined by Walker: the resolution of an object, whether of the senses or of the intellect, into its first elements, as opposed to synthesis. You observe. Now you know what analysis is." Dobby didn't seem to be absolutely blinded by the light let in upon his intellect, but he made Miss Bleember a little bow. "Analysis," resumed Miss Bleember, casting her eye over the paper, "of the character of P. Dombey, I find that the natural capacity of Dombey is extremely good, and that his general disposition to study may be stated in an equal ratio. Thus, taking 8 as our standard and highest number, I find these qualities in Dombey stated each at 6¾ Miss Bleember paused to see how Paul received this news, being undecided whether 6¾ meant 615 pounds or 6 3 farthings, or 6 foot 3 or 3/4 past 6 or 6. Some things that he hadn't learnt yet with 3 unknown. Something else is over. Paul rubbed his hands and looked straight at Miss Bleember. It happened to answer as well as anything else he could have done, and Cornelia proceeded: violence to selfishness, to inclination, to low company, as evinced in the case of a person named Club, originally 7, but since reduced gentlemanly demeanor 4, and improving with advancing years. Now what I particularly wish to call your attention to is the general observation. At the close of this analysis, Paul set himself to follow it with great care. "It may be generally observed of Dobby," said Miss Bleember, reading in a loud voice and at every second word directing her spectacles towards the little figure before her, "that his abilities and inclinations are good, and that he has made as much progress as under the circumstances could have been expected. But it is to be lamented of this young gentleman that he is singular, what is usually termed old-fashioned in his character and conduct, and that without presenting anything in either which distinctly calls for reprobation, he is often very unlike other young gentlemen of his age and social position." "Now, Dobby," said Miss Bleember, laying down the paper, "do you understand that?" "I think I do, ma'am," said Paul. "This analysis, you see, Dombey," Miss Bleember continued, "is going to be sent home to your respected parent. It will naturally be very painful to him to find that you are singular in your character and conduct. It is naturally painful to us, for we can't like you know, Dombey, as well as we could wish." She touched the child upon a tender point. He had secretly become more and more solicitous from day to day, as the time of his departure drew more near, that all the house should like him from some hidden reason, very imperfectly understood by himself, if understood at all. He felt a gradually increasing impulse of affection towards almost everything and everybody in the place. He could not bear to think that they would be quite indifferent to him. When he was gone, he wanted them to remember him kindly, and he had made it his business even to conciliate a great horse shaggy dog chained up at the back of the house, who had previously been the terror of his life, that even he might miss him when he was no longer there, little thinking that in this he only showed again the difference between himself and his compeers. Poor tiny Paul set it forth to Miss Bleember as well as he could, and begged her, in despite of the official analysis, to have the goodness to try and like him. To Mrs. Bleember, who had joined them, he preferred the same petition, and when that lady could not forbear, even in his presence, from giving utterance to her often repeated opinion that he was an odd child, Paul told her that he was sure she was quite right, that he thought it must be his bones, but he didn't know, and that he hoped she would overlook it, for he was fond of them all. "Not so fond," said Paul, with a mixture of timidity and perfect frankness, which was one of the most peculiar and most engaging qualities of the child. "Not so fond as I am of Florence, of course. That could never be. You couldn't expect that, could you, Mom? Oh, the old-fashioned little soul," cried Mrs. Bleember in a whisper. But I, like everybody here, very much pursued Paul, and I should grieve to go away and think that anyone was glad that I was gone or didn't care. Mrs. Bleember was now quite sure that Paul was the oddest child in the world, and when she told the doctor what had passed, the doctor did not controvert his wife's opinion. But he said, as he had said before when Paul first came, that study would do much. And he also said, as he had said on that occasion, bring him on Cornelia, bring him on Cornelia, had always brought him on as vigorously as she could. And Paul had had a hard life of it, but over and above the getting through his tasks, he had long had another purpose, always present to him, and to which he still held fast. It was to be a gentle, useful, quiet little fellow, always striving to secure the love and attachment of the rest. And though he was yet often to be seen at his old post on the stairs, or watching the waves and clouds from his solitary window, he was often found to among the other boys, modestly rendering them some little voluntary service. Thus it came to pass that even among those rigid and absorbed young anchorites, who mortified themselves beneath the roof of Dr. Bleember, Paul was an object of general interest, a fragile little plaything that they all liked, and that no one would have thought of treating roughly. But he could not change his nature or rewrite the analysis, and so they all agreed that Dombey was old-fashioned. There were some immunities, however, attaching to the character enjoyed by no one else. They could have better spared a newer-fashioned child, and that alone was much when the others only bowed to Dr. Bleember. And family, on retiring for the night, Paul would stretch out his morsel of a hand and boldly shake the doctor's, also Mrs. Bleember's, also Cornelia's. If anybody was to be begged off from impending punishment, Paul was always the delegate, the weak-eyed young man himself had once consulted him in reference to a little breakage of glass in China, and it was darkly rumored that the butler, regarding him with favor such as that stern man had never shown before to mortal boy, had sometimes mingled porter with his table beer to make him strong over, and above these extensive privileges, Paul had free right of entry to Mr. Feeder's room, from which apartment he had twice led Mr. Toots into the open air in a state of faintness, consequent on an unsuccessful attempt to smoke a very blunt cigar, one of a bundle which that young gentleman had covertly purchased on the shingle from a most desperate smuggler, who had acknowledged in confidence that £200 was the price set upon his head, dead or alive, by the custom house. It was a snug room, Mr. Fielder's, with his bed in another little room inside of it, and a flute which Mr. Fielder couldn't play yet, but was going to make a point of learning, he said, hanging up over the fireplace. There were some books in it too, and a fishing rod, for Mr. Feeder said he should certainly make a point of learning to fish when he could find time. Mr. Feeder had amassed with similar intentions a beautiful little curly second-hand key bugle, a chessboard and men, a Spanish grammar, a set of sketching materials, and a pair of boxing gloves. The art of self-defense, Mr. Fielder said he should undoubtedly make a point of learning, as he considered it the duty of every man to do, for it might lead to the protection of a female in distress. But Mr. Feeder's great possession was a large green jar of snuff, which Mr. Toots had brought down as a present at the close of the last vacation, and for which he had paid a high price. Having been the genuine property of the Prince Regent, neither Mr. Toots nor Mr. Feeder could partake of this or any other snuff, even in the most stinted and moderate degree, without being seized with convulsions of sneezing. Nevertheless, it was their great delight to moisten a box full with cold tea stirred up on a piece of parchment with a paper knife, and devote themselves to its consumption then and there, in the course of which cramming of their noses they endured surprising torments with the constancy of martyrs, and drinking table beer at intervals, felt all the glories of dissipation, to little Paul sitting silent in their company, and by the side of his chief patron, Mr. Toots. There was a dread charm in these reckless occasions, and when Mr. Feeder spoke of the dark mysteries of London, and told Mr. Toots that he was going to observe it himself closely in all its ramifications in the approaching holidays, and for that purpose had made arrangements to board with 2 old maiden ladies at Peckham, Paul regarded him as if he were the hero of some book of travels or wild adventure, and was almost afraid of such a slashing person going into this room one evening when the holidays were very near. Paul found Mr. Feeder filling up the blanks in some printed letters, while some others already filled up and strewn before him were being folded and sealed by Mr. Toots. Mr. Fielder said, "Ha ha, Dombey, there you are you?" For they were always kind to him and glad to see him, and then said, tossing one of the letters towards him, "And there you are to Dobby, that's yours." "Mine, sir," said Paul. "Your invitation," returned Mr. Feeder. Paul, looking at it, found in copperplate print, with the exception of his own name and the date, which were in Mr. Feeder's penmanship, that Dr. and Mrs. Bleember requested the pleasure of Mr. P. Dombey's company at an early party on Wednesday evening, the 17th instant, and that the hour was 7:30, and that the object was quadrilles. Mr. Toots also showed him by holding up a companion sheet of paper that Dr. and Mrs. Bleember requested the pleasure of Mr. Toots's company at an early party on Wednesday evening, the 17th instant, when the hour was 7:30, and when the object was quadrilles. He also found, on glancing at the table where Mr. Feeder sat, that the pleasure of Mr. Briggs's company, and of Mr. Toes's company, and of every young gentleman's company was requested by Dr. and Mrs. Bleember on the same genteel occasion. Mr. Feeder then told him, to his great joy, that his sister was invited, and that it was a half-yearly event, and that as the holidays began that day, he could go away with his sister after the party if he liked, which Paul interrupted him to say he would like very much. Mr. Feeder then gave him to understand that he would be expected to inform Dr. and Mrs. Bleember in superfine small hand that Mr. P. Dombey would be happy to have the honor of waiting on them in accordance with their polite invitation. Lastly, Mr. Fetters said he had better not refer to the festivity occasion in the hearing of Dr. and Mrs. Bleember, as these preliminaries and the whole of the arrangements were conducted on principles of classicality and high breeding, and that Dr. and Mrs. Bleember on the one hand and the young gentlemen on the other were supposed in their scholastic capacities not to have the least idea of what was in the wind. Paul thanked Mr. Feeder for these hints, and pocketing his invitation, sat down on a stool by the side of Mr. Toots as usual. But Paul's head, which had long been ailing more or less, and was sometimes very heavy and painful, felt so uneasy that night that he was obliged to support it on his hand, and yet it dropped so that by little and little it sunk onto Mr. Tootsie's knee and rested there as if it had no care to be ever lifted up again. That was no reason why he should be deaf, but he must have been, he thought, for by and by he heard Mr. Feeder calling in his ear and gently shaking him to rouse his attention, and when he raised his head quite scared and looked about him, he found that Dr. Bleember had come into the room, and that the window was open, and that his forehead was wet with sprinkled water, though how all this had been done without his knowledge was very curious indeed. "Ah, come, that's well. How is my little friend now?" said Dr. Bleember encouragingly. "Oh, quite well, thank you, sir," said Paul. But there seemed to be something the matter with the floor, for he couldn't stand upon it steadily, and with the walls too, for they were inclined to turn round and round, and could only be stopped by being looked at very hard. Indeed, Mr. Toots's head had the appearance of being at once bigger and farther off than was quite natural, and when he took Paul in his arms to carry him upstairs, Paul observed with astonishment that the door was in quite a different place from that in which he had expected to find it, and almost thought at first that Mr. Toots was going to walk straight up the chimney. It was very kind of Mr. Toots to carry him to the top of the house so tenderly, and Paul told him that it was, but Mr. Toots said he would do a great deal more than that if he could, and indeed he did do more as it was, for he helped Paul to undress and helped him to bed in the kindest manner possible, and then sat down by the bedside and chuckled very much, while Mr. Fido B.A., leaning over the bottom of the bedstead, set all the little bristles on his head bolt upright with his bony hands, and then made believe to spar at Paul with great science on account of his being all right again, which was so uncommonly facetious and kind to Mr. Feeder that Paul, not being able to make up his mind whether it was best to laugh or cry at him, did both at once. How Mr. Toots melted away, and Mr. Feeder changed into Mrs. Peepchin. All never thought of asking, neither was he at all curious to know. But when he saw Mrs. Peepchin standing at the bottom of the bed instead of Mr. Feeder, he cried out, "Mrs. Peepchin, don't tell Florence, don't tell Florence what my little Paul said." Mrs. Peepchin, coming round to the bedside and sitting down in the chair about me, said Paul. No, said Mrs. Peepchin. "What do you think I mean to do when I grow up?" Mrs. Peepchin inquired. Paul, turning his face towards her on his pillow, and resting his chin wistfully on his folded hands. "Mrs. Pipkin couldn't guess. Said Paul, "to put my money all together in one bank, never try to get any more, go away into the country with my darling Florence, have a beautiful garden, fields and woods, and live there with her all my life." "Indeed," cried Mrs. Pipkin. "Yes," said Paul, "that's what I mean to do." He stopped and pondered for a moment. Mrs. Pipkin's gray eyes scanned his thoughtful face. "If I grow up," said Paul. Then he went on immediately to tell Mrs. Pipkin all about the party, about Florence's invitation, about the pride he would have in the admiration that would be felt for her by all the boys, about their being so kind to him and fond of him, about his being so fond of them, and about his being so glad of it. Then he told Mrs. Pipkin about the analysis and about his being certainly old-fashioned, and took Mrs. Pipkin's opinion on that point, and whether she knew why it was and what it meant. Mrs. Pipkin denied the fact altogether as the shortest way of getting out of the difficulty. But Paul was far from satisfied with that reply, and looked so searchingly at Mrs. Pipkin for a truer answer that she was obliged to get up and look out of the window to avoid his eyes. There was a certain calm apothecary who attended at the establishment when any of the young gentlemen were ill, and somehow he got into the room and appeared at the bedside with Mrs. Bleember. How they came there, or how long they had been there, Paul didn't know. But when he saw them, he sat up in bed and answered all the apothecary's questions at full length, and whispered to him that Florence was not to know anything about it if he pleased, and that he had set his mind upon her coming to the party. He was very chatty with the apothecary, and they parted excellent friends. Lying down again, with his eyes shut, he heard the apothecary say out of the room, and quite a long way off, or he dreamed it, that there was a want of vital power. What was that, Paul wondered, and great constitutional weakness, that as the little fellow had set his heart on parting with his schoolmates on the 17th, it would be better to indulge the fancy, if he grew no worse, that he was glad to hear from Mrs. Pipkin that the little fellow would go to his friends in London on the 18th, that he would write to Mr. Dombey when he should have gained a better knowledge of the case, and before that day, that there was no immediate cause for what Paul lost that word, and that the little fellow had a fine mind, but was an old-fashioned boy. What old-fashioned could that be? Paul wondered with a palpitating heart that was so visibly expressed in him, so plainly seen by so many people. He could neither make it out nor trouble himself along with the effort. Mrs. Pipkin was again beside him. If she had ever been away, he thought she had gone out with the doctor, but it was all a dream perhaps. And presently a bottle and glass got into her hands magically, and she poured out the contents for him. After that he had some real good jelly which Mrs. Bleember brought to him herself, and then he was so well that Mrs. Pipkin went home at his urgent solicitation, and Briggs and Tozer came to bed. Poor Briggs grumbled terribly about his own analysis, which could hardly have discomposed him more if it had been a chemical process, but he was very good to Paul, and so was Tosa, and so were all the rest, for they every one looked in before going to bed and said, "How are you now, Dobby? Cheer up, little Dobby," and so forth. After Briggs had got into bed, he lay awake for a long time, still bemoaning the analysis, and saying he knew it was all wrong, and they couldn't have analyzed a murderer worse, and how would Dr. Bleember like it if his pocket money depended on it? It was very easy, Briggs said, to make a galley slave of a boy all the half year, and then score him up idle, and to crib to dinners a week out of his board, and then score him up greedy. But that wasn't going to be submitted to. He believed was at ho-ha before the weak-eyed young man performed on the gong. Next morning he came upstairs to Paul and told him he was to lie still, which Paul very gladly did. Mrs. Pipkin reappeared a little before the apothecary, and a little after the good young woman whom Paul had seen cleaning the stove on that first morning. How long ago it seemed! Had brought him his breakfast. There was another consultation, a long way off, or else Paul dreamed it again. And then the apothecary, coming back with Dr. and Mrs. Bleember, said, "Yes, I think, Dr. Bleember, we may release this young gentleman from his books just now, the vacation being so very near at hand." "By all means," said Dr. Blimbo, "my love, you will inform Cornelia, if you please." "Assuredly," said Mrs. Bleember. The apothecary, bending down, looked closely into Paul's eyes and felt his head and his pulse and his heart with so much interest and care that Paul said, "Thank you, sir. Our little friend," observed Dr. Bleember, "has never complained "Oh no," replied the apothecary, "he was not likely to complain. You find him greatly better," said Dr. Bleember. "Oh, he is greatly better, sir," returned the apothecary. Paul had begun to speculate in his own odd way on the subject that might occupy the apothecary's mind. Just at that moment, so musingly had he answered the two questions of Dr. Bleember, but the apothecary, happening to meet his little patient's eyes as the latter set off on that mental expedition, and coming instantly out of his abstraction with a cheerful smile, Paul smiled in return and abandoned it. He lay in bed all that day, dozing and dreaming and looking at Mr. Toots, but got up on the next and went downstairs. Lo, and behold, there was something the matter with the great clock, and a workman on a pair of steps had taken its face off and was poking instruments into the works by the light of a candle. This was a great event for Paul, who sat down on the bottom stair and watched the operation attentively now and then, glancing at the clock face leaning all askew against the wall hard by, and feeling a little confused by a suspicion that it was ogling him. The workman on the steps was very civil, and as he said when he observed Paul, "How do you do, sir?" Paul got into conversation with him and told him he hadn't been quite well lately, the ice being thus broken. Paul asked him a multitude of questions about chimes and clocks, as whether people watched up in the lonely church steeples by night to make them strike, and how the bells were rung when people died, and whether those were different bells from wedding bells, or only sounded dismal in the fancies of the living. Finding that his new acquaintance was not very well informed on the subject of the curfew bell of ancient days, Paul gave him an account of that institution, and also asked him as a practical man what he thought about King Alfred's idea of measuring time by the burning of candles, to which the workman replied that he thought it would be the ruin of the clock trade if it was to come up again. In fine, Paul looked on until the clock had quite recovered its familiar aspect and resumed its sedate inquiry, when the workman, putting away his tools in a long basket, patted him good day and went away, though not before he had whispered something on the doormat to the footman, in which there was the phrase "old-fashioned," for Paul heard it. What could that old-fashioned be that seemed to make the people sorry? What could it be, having nothing to learn? Now he thought of this frequently, though not so often as he might have done if he had had fewer things to think of. But he had a great many, and was always thinking all day long. First, there was Florence coming to the party. Florence would see that the boys were fond of him, and that would make her happy. This was his great theme. Let Florence once be sure that they were gentle and good to him, and that he had become a little favorite among them, and then she would always think of the time he had passed there without being very sorry. Florence might be all the happier too for that. Perhaps when he came back 50 times a day, his noiseless little feet went up the stairs to his own room, as he collected every book and scrap and trifle that belonged to him and put them all together. They're down to the minutest thing for taking home. There was no shade of coming back on little Paul, no preparation for it or other reference to it grew out of anything he thought or did, except this slight one in connection with his sister. On the contrary, he had to think of everything familiar to him in his contemplative moods and in his wanderings about the house as being to be parted with, and hence the many things he had to think of all day long. He had to peep into those rooms upstairs and think how solitary they would be when he was gone, and wonder through how many silent days, weeks, months, and years they would continue just as grave and undisturbed. He had to think, would any other child, old-fashioned like himself, stray there at any time, to whom the same grotesque distortions of pattern and furniture would manifest themselves? And would anybody tell that boy of little Dumby who had been there once? He had to think of a portrait on the stairs which always looked earnestly after him as he went away, eyeing it over his shoulder, and which, when he passed it in the company of anyone, still seemed to gaze at him and not at his companion. He had much to think of in association with a print that hung up in another place, where in the center of a wandering group, one figure that he knew, a figure with a light about its head, benignant, mild, and merciful, stood pointing upward at his own bedroom window. There were crowds of thoughts that mixed with these and came on one upon another like the rolling waves where those wild birds lived that were always hovering out at sea in troubled weather, where the clouds rose and first began, whence the wind issued on its rushing flight, and where it stopped weather. The spot where he and Florence had so often sat and watched and talked about these things could ever be exactly as it used to be without them, whether it could ever be the same to Florence if he were in some distant place and she was sitting there. Alone he had to think too of Mr. Toots and Mr. Feeder B.A. of all the boys, and of Dr. Bleember, Mrs. Bleember, and Miss Bleember of home, and of his aunt and Miss Toots, of his father Dunbane's son Walter, with the poor old uncle who had got the money he wanted, and that gruff-voiced captain with the iron hand. Besides all this, he had a number of little visits to pay in the course of the day, to the schoolroom, to Dr. Bleember's study, to Mrs. Bleember's private apartment, to Miss Bleember's, and to the dog, for he was free of the whole house now to range it as he chose, and in his desire to part with everybody on affectionate terms, he attended in his way to the mall. Sometimes he found places in books for Briggs, who was always losing them. Sometimes he looked up words in dictionaries for other young gentlemen who were in extremity. Sometimes he held skeins of silk for Mrs. Bleember to wind. Sometimes he put Cornelia's desk to rights. Sometimes he would even creep into the doctor's study, and sitting on the carpet near his learned feet, turn the globes softly and go round the world, or take a flight among the far-off stars in those days immediately before the holidays. In short, when the other young gentlemen were laboring for dear life through a general resumption of the studies of the whole half-year, Paul was such a privileged pupil as had never been seen in that house before. He could hardly believe it himself, but his liberty lasted from hour to hour and from day to day, and little Dobby was caressed by everyone. Dr. Bleember was so particular about him that he requested Johnson to retire from the dinner table one day for having thoughtlessly spoken to him as poor little Dobby, which Paul thought rather hard and severe, though he had flushed at the moment and wondered why Johnson should pity him. It was the more questionable justice, Paul thought, in the doctor from his having certainly overheard that great authority give his assent on the previous evening to the proposition stated by Mrs. Bleember that poor dear little Dumby was more old-fashioned than ever. And now it was that Paul began to think it must surely be old-fashioned to be very thin and light, and easily tired, and soon disposed to lie down anywhere and rest, for he couldn't help feeling that these were more and more his habits every day. At last the party day arrived, and Dr. Bleember said at breakfast, "Gentlemen, we will resume our studies on the 25th of next month." Mr. Toots immediately threw off his allegiance and put on his ring, and mentioning the doctor in casual conversation shortly afterwards, spoke of him as Bleember. This act of freedom inspired the older pupils with admiration and envy, but the younger spirits were appalled and seemed to marvel that no beam fell down and crushed him. Not the least allusion was made to the ceremonies of the evening, either at breakfast or at dinner, but there was a bustle in the house all day, and in the course of his perambulations, Paul made acquaintance with various strange benches and candlesticks, and met a harp in a green greatcoat standing on the landing outside the drawing-room door. There was something queer too about Mrs. Bleember's head at dinner time, as if she had screwed her hair up too tight, and though Miss Bleember showed a graceful bunch of plaited hair on each temple, she seemed to have her own little curls and paper underneath, and in a playbill too for Paul Reed Theatre Royal over one of her sparkling spectacles, and Brighton over the other. There was a grand array of white waistcoats and cravats in the young gentlemen's bedrooms as evening approached, and such a smell of singed hair that Dr. Bleember sent up the footman with his compliments and wished to know if the house was on fire. But it was only the hairdresser curling the young gentleman and overheating his tongues in the ardor of business when Paul was dressed, which was very soon done, for he felt unwell and drowsy, and was not able to stand about it very long. He went down into the drawing-room, where he found Dr. Bleember pacing up and down the room full dressed, but with a dignified and unconcerned demeanor, as if he thought it barely possible that one or two people might drop in by. And by shortly afterwards Mrs. Bleember appeared, looking lovely, Paul thought, and attired in such a number of skirts that it was quite an excursion to walk round her. Miss Bleember came down soon after her mamma, a little squeezed in appearance, but very charming. Mr. Toots and Mr. Feeder were the next arrivals. Each of these gentlemen brought his hat in his hand as if he lived somewhere else, and when they were announced by the butler, Dr. Bleember said, God bless my soul," and seemed extremely glad to see them. Mr. Toots was one blaze of jewelry and buttons, and he felt the circumstance so strongly that when he had shaken hands with the doctor and bowed to Mrs. Bleember and Miss Bleember, he took Paul aside and said, "What do you think of this tomboy?" But notwithstanding this modest confidence in himself, Mr. Toots appeared to be involved in a good deal of uncertainty whether on the whole it was judicious to button the bottom button of his waistcoat, and whether on a calm revision of all the circumstances it was best to wear his waistbands turned up or turned down. Observing that Mr. Feeder's were turned up, Mr. Toots turned his up, but the waistbands of the next arrival being turned down, Mr. Toots turned his down. The differences in point of waistcoat buttoning, not only the bottom but at the top, to became so numerous and complicated as the arrivals thickened that Mr. Toots was continually fingering that article of dress as if he were performing on some instrument, and appeared to find the incessant execution it demanded quite bewildering. All the young gentlemen, tightly cravated, curled, and pumped in with their best hats in their hands, having been at different times announced and introduced. Mr. Baps, the dancing master, came accompanied by Mrs. Baps, to whom Mrs. Bleember was extremely kind and condescending. Mr. Baps was a very grave gentleman, with a slow and measured manner of speaking, and before he had stood under the lamp 5 minutes, he began to talk to Toots, who had been silently comparing pumps with him, about what you were to do with your raw materials when they came into your ports in return for your drain of gold. Mr. Toots, to whom the question seemed perplexing, suggested cook him, but Mr. Baps did not appear to think that would do. Paul now slipped away from the cushioned corner of a sofa, which had been his post of observation, and went downstairs into the tea-room to be ready for Florence, whom he had not seen for nearly a fortnight, as he had remained at Dr. Blimburn's on the previous Saturday and Sunday, lest he should take cold. Presently she came, looking so beautiful in her simple ball dress, with her fresh flowers in her hand, that when she knelt down on the ground to take Paul round the neck and kiss him, for there was no one there but his friend and another young woman waiting to serve out the tea, he could hardly make up his mind to let her go again, or to take away her bright and loving eyes from his face. "But what is the matter, Floy?" asked Paul, almost sure that he saw a tear there. "Nothing, darling, nothing," returned Florence. Paul touched her cheek gently with his finger, and it was a tear. "Why," Floy said, "he will go home together, and I'll nurse you, love," said Florence. "Nurse me?" echoed Paul. Paul couldn't understand what that had to do with it, nor why the two young women looked on so seriously, nor why Florence turned away her face for a moment, and then turned it back, lighted up again with smiles. "Floy," said Paul, holding a ringlet of her dark hair in his hand, "tell me, dear, do you think I have grown old-fashioned?" His sister laughed and fondled him and told him no, "Because I know they say so," returned Paul, "and I want to know what they mean, Floy." But a loud double knock coming at the door, and Florence hurrying to the table, there was no more said between them. Paul wondered again when he saw his friend whisper to Florence, as if she were comforting her, but a new arrival put that out of his head speedily. It was Sir Bernard Skettles, Lady Skettles, and Master Skettles. Master Skettles was to be a new boy after the vacation, and fame had been busy in Mr. Fielder's room with his father, who was in the House of Commons, and of whom Mr. Fielder had said that when he did catch the speakers, at which he had been expected to do for 3 or 4 years, it was anticipated that he would rather touch up the radicals. "And what room is this now, for instance?" said Lady Skettles to Paul's friend Melia. "Dr. Blimba's study, ma'am," was the reply. Lady Skettles took a panoramic survey of it through her glass, and said to Sir Barnard Skettles, with a nod of approval, "Very good." Sabana dissented, but Master Skettles looked suspicious and doubtful. "And this little creature now," said Lady Skettles, turning to Paul, "is he one of the young gentlemen, ma'am?" "Yes, ma'am," said Paul's friend. "And what is your name?" "My pale child," said Lady Skettles. "Donby," answered Paul. Sir Barnet Kettles immediately interposed and said that he had had the honor of meeting Paul's father at a public dinner, and that he hoped he was very well. Then Paul heard him say to Lady Kettles, "City, very rich, most respectable." Doctor mentioned it, and then he said to Paul, "Will you tell your good papa that Sir Barnet Skettles rejoiced to hear that he was very well and sent him his best compliments?" "Yes, sir," answered Paul. "That is my brave boy," said Sir Barnard Skettles. Barnard to Master Skettles, who was revenging himself for the studies to come on the plum cake. "This is a young gentleman you ought to know. This is a young gentleman you may "No, Barnard," said Sir Barnard Skettles, with an emphasis on the permission. "What eyes, what hair, what a lovely face," exclaimed Lady Skettles softly, as she looked at Florence through her glass. "My sister," said Paul, presenting her the satisfaction of the Skettles was now complete, and as Lady Skettles had conceived at first sight a liking for Paul, they all went upstairs together, Sir Barnet Skettles taking care of Florence and young Barnet following. Young Barnet did not remain long in the background after they had reached the drawing room, for Dr. Bleember had him out in no time dancing with Florence. He did not appear to Paul to be particularly happy or particularly anything but sulky or to care much what he was about. But as Paul heard Lady Skettles say to Mrs. Bleember, while she beat time with her fan, that her dear boy was evidently smitten to death by that angel of a child, Miss Dombey, it would seem that Skettles Jr. was in a state of bliss without showing it. Little Paul thought it a singular coincidence that nobody had occupied his place among the pillows, and that when he came into the room again, they should all make way for him to go back to it, remembering it was as nobody stood before him either. When they observed that he liked to see Florence dancing, but they left the space in front quite clear, so that he might follow her with his eyes, they were so kind to even the strangers, of whom there were soon a great many, that they came and spoke to him every now and then, and asked him how he was, and if his head ached, and whether he was tired. He was very much obliged to them for all their kindness and attention, and reclining propped up in his corner with Mrs. Bleember and Lady Skettles on the same sofa, and Florence coming and sitting by his side as soon as every dance was ended, he looked on very happily indeed. Florence would have sat by him all night, and would not have danced at all of her own accord, but Paul made her by telling her how much it pleased him, and he told her the truth too, for his small heart swelled, and his face glowed when he saw how much they all admired her, and how she was the beautiful little rosebud of the room. From his nest among the pillows Paul could see and hear almost everything that passed, as if the whole were being done for his amusement. Among other little incidents that he observed Mr. Baps, the dancing master, get into conversation with Sabinet Skettles, and very soon ask him, as he had asked Mr. Toots, what you were to do with your raw materials when they came into your ports in return for your drain of gold, which was such a mystery to Paul that he was quite desirous to know what ought to be done with them. Sir Barnet Skettles had much to say upon the question, and said it, but it did not appear to solve the question, for Mr. Baps retorted yes, but supposing Russia stepped in with her tallows, which struck Sir Barnard almost dumb before he could only shake his head after that, and say, "Why then you must fall back upon your cottons." He supposed Sir Barnet Skettles looked after Mr. Baps when he went to cheer up Mrs. Baps, who, being quite deserted, was pretending to look over the music book of the gentleman who played the harp, as if he thought him a remarkable kind of man, and shortly afterwards he said so in those words to Dr. Bleember, and inquired if he might take the liberty of asking who he was, and whether he had ever been in the Board of Trade. Dr. Bleember answered no, he believed not, and that in fact he was a professor of something connected with statistics. "I'll swear," observed Sabinet Skettles. "Why no, Sabanet," replied Dr. Bleember, rubbing his chin. "No, not exactly. Figures of some sort, I would venture a bet," said Sir Barnet Skettles. "Why yes," said Dr. Bleember, "yes, but not of that sort. Mr. Babs is a very worthy sort of man," said Barnet, "and in fact he's our professor of dancing." Paul was amazed to see that this piece of information quite altered Sir Barnet Skettles' opinion of Mr. Babs, and that Sir Barnet flew into a perfect rage and glowered at Mr. Baps over on the other side of the room. He even went so far as to dap Mr. Baps to Lady Skettles in telling her what had happened, and to say that it was like his most consummate and confounded impudence. There was another thing that Paul observed. Mr. Feeder, after imbibing several custard cups of neguas, began to enjoy himself. The dancing in general was ceremonious, and the music rather solemn, a little like church music in fact. But after the custard cups, Mr. Feeder told Mr. Toots that he was going to throw a little spirit into the thing. After that, Mr. Feeder not only began to dance as if he meant dancing and nothing else, but secretly to stimulate the music to perform wild tunes. Further, he became particular in his attentions to the ladies, and dancing with Miss Bleember whispered to her, though not so softly, but that Paul heard him say this remarkable poetry, Had I a heart for falsehood framed, I ne'er could injure you. This Paul heard him repeat to for young ladies in succession. Well might Mr. Feeder say to Mr. Toots that he was afraid he should be the worse for it tomorrow. Mrs. Bleember was a little alarmed by this comparatively speaking profligate behavior, and especially by the alteration in the character of the music, which, beginning to comprehend the low melodies that were popular in the streets, might not unnaturally be supposed to give offense to Lady Skettles. But Lady Skettles was so very kind as to beg Mrs. Bleember not to mention it, and to receive her explanation that Mr. Feeder's spirits sometimes betrayed him into excesses on these occasions, with the greatest courtesy and politeness, observing that he seemed a very nice sort of person for his situation, and that you particularly liked the unassuming style of his hair, which is already hinted was about 1/4 of an inch long. Once, when there was a pause in the dancing, Lady Skettles told Paul that he seemed very fond of music. Paul replied that he was, and if she was too, she ought to hear his sister Florence sing. Lady Skettles presently discovered that she was dying with anxiety to have that gratification, and though Florence was at first very much frightened at being asked to sing before so many people, and begged earnestly to be excused, yet on Paul calling her to him and saying, "Do Floy, please, for me, my dear," she went straight to the piano and began, when they all drew a little away that Paul might see her. And when he saw her sitting there all alone, so young and good and beautiful and kind to him, and heard her thrilling voice so natural and sweet, and such a golden link between him and all his life's love and happiness rising out of the silence, he turned his face away and hid his tears, not as he told them when they spoke to him, not that the music was too plaintive or too sorrowful, but it was so dear to him. They all loved Florence. How could they help it? Paul had known beforehand that they must and would, and sitting in his cushioned corner with calmly folded arms and one leg loosely doubled under him, few would have thought what triumph and delight expanded his childish bosom while he watched her, or what a sweet tranquility he felt lavish encomiums on Dobby's sister reached his ears from all the boys' admiration of the self-possessed and modest little beauty was on every lip. Reports of her intelligence and accomplishments floated past him constantly, and as if borne in upon the air of the summer night, there was a half-intelligible sentiment diffused around referring to Florence and himself, and breathing sympathy for both, that soothed and touched him. He did not know why, for all that the child observed and felt and thought that night, the present and the absent, what was then and what had been, were blended like the colors in the rainbow, or in the plumage of rich birds when the sun is shining on them, or in the softening sky when the same sun is setting. The many things he had had to think of lately passed before him in the music, not as claiming his attention over again, or as likely ever more to occupy it, but as peacefully disposed of and gone. A solitary window gazed through years ago looked out upon an ocean miles and miles away upon its waters. Fancies busy with him only yesterday were hushed and lulled to rest like broken waves. The same mysterious murmur he had wondered at when lying on his couch upon the beach, he thought he still heard sounding through his sister's song and through the hum of voices and the tread of feet, and having some part in the faces flitting by, and even in the heavy gentleness of Mr. Toots, who frequently came up to shake him by the hand. Through the universal kindness, he still thought he heard it speaking to him, and even his old-fashioned reputation seemed to be allied to it. He knew not how. Thus little Paul sat musing, listening, looking on, and dreaming, and was very happy until the time arrived for taking leave. And then indeed there was a sensation in the party. Sir Barnard Skettles brought up Skettles Jr. to shake hands with him, and asked him if he would remember to tell his good papa, with his best compliments, that he, Sir Barnard Skettles, had said he hoped the two young gentlemen would become intimately acquainted. Lady Skettles kissed him and patted his hair upon his brow and held him in our arms, and even Mrs. Baps, poor Mrs. Baps, Paul was glad of that, came over from beside the music book of the gentleman who played the harp, and took leave of him quite as heartily as anybody in the room. "Goodbye, Dr. Bleember," said Paul, stretching out his hand. "Goodbye, my little friend," returned the doctor. "I'm very much obliged to you, sir," said Paul, looking innocently up into his awful face. "Ask them to take care of Diogenes, if you please." Diogenes was the dog who had never in his life received a friend into his confidence before Paul. The doctor promised that every attention should be paid to Diogenes in Paul's absence, and Paul, having again thanked him and shaken hands with him bade you to Mrs. Bleember and Cornelia with such heartfelt earnestness that Mrs. Bleember forgot from that moment to mention Cicero to Lady Skettles, though she had fully intended it all the evening, Cornelia taking both Paul's hands. In hers said, Dombey, you have always been my favorite pupil, God bless you. And it showed Paul thought how easily one might do injustice to a person, for Miss Bleember meant it though she was a falser, and felt it a buzz, then went round among the young gentlemen of Dobby's going, little Dobby's going, and there was a general move after Paul and Florence down the staircase and into the hall in which the whole Bleember family were included. Such a circumstance, Mr. Fido said aloud, as had never happened in the case of any former young gentleman within his experience. But it would be difficult to say if this was sober fact or custard cups. The servants with the butler at their head had all an interest in seeing little Dombey go, and even the wee-eyed young man taking out his books and trunks to the coach that was to carry him and Florence to Mrs. Pipkin's for the night melted visibly not even the influence of the softer passion on the young gentleman, and they all to a boy doted on Florence could restrain them from taking quite a noisy leave of Paul, waving hats after him, pressing downstairs to shake hands with him, crying individually, Dombey, don't forget me, and indulging in many such ebullitions of feeling uncommon. Among those young Chesterfields, Paul whispered Florence, as she wrapped him up before the door was opened. Did she hear them? Would she ever forget it? Was she glad to know it? And a lively delight was in his eyes as he spoke to her once for a last look. He turned and gazed upon the faces thus addressed to him, surprised to see how shining and how bright and numerous they were, and how they were all piled and heaped up as faces are at crowded theaters. They swam before him, as he looked like faces in an agitated glass, and next moment he was in the dark coach outside, holding close to Florence. From that time, whenever he thought of Dr. Bleember's, it came back as he had seen it in this last view, and it never seemed to be a real place again, but always a dream full of eyes. This was not quite the last of Dr. Bleember's. However, there was something else. There was Mr. Toots, who unexpectedly letting down one of the coach windows and looking in said with a most egregious chuckle, Is Dombey there? And immediately put it up again, without waiting for an answer. Nor was this quite the last of Mr. Toots, even for before the coachman could drive off he has suddenly let down the other window, and looking in with a precisely similar chuckle said in a precisely similar tone of voice, It don't be there, and disappeared precisely as before. How Florence laughed! Paul often remembered it, and laughed himself whenever he did so. But there was much soon afterwards, next day, and after that, which Paul could only recollect confusedly, as why they stayed at Mrs. Pipkin's days and nights, instead of going home, why he lay in bed with Florence sitting by his side, whether that had been his father in the room or only a tall shadow on the wall, whether he had heard his doctor say of someone that if they had removed him before the occasion on which he had built up fancies strong in proportion to his own weakness, it was very possible he might have pined away. He could not even remember whether he had often said to Florence, Oh Floy, take me home and never leave me, but he thought he fancied sometimes he had heard himself repeating, Take me home, Floy, take me home. But he could remember when he got home and was carried up the well-remembered stairs that there had been the rumbling of a coach for many hours together, while he lay upon the seat with Florence still beside him and old Miss Pipkin sitting opposite. He remembered his old bed too, when they laid him down in it, his Aunt Miss Tokes and Susan. But there was something else and recent too that still perplexed him. I want to speak to Florence, if you please, he said to Florence by herself. For a moment she bent down over him, and the others stood away. Floy, my pet, wasn't that Papa in the hall when they brought me from the coach? Yes, dear. He didn't cry and go into his room, Floyd, did he, when he saw me coming in? Florence shook her head and pressed her lips against his cheek. I'm very glad he didn't cry, said little Paul. I thought he did. Don't tell them that I asked. Chapter 15. Amazing artfulness of Captain Cuttle, and a new pursuit for Walter Gay. Walter could not for several days decide what to do in the Barbados business, and even cherished some faint hope that Mr. Dombey might not have meant what he had said, or that he might change his mind and tell him he was not to go. But as nothing occurred to give this idea, which was sufficiently improbable in itself, any touch of confirmation, and as time was slipping by, and he had none to lose, he felt that he must act without hesitating any longer. Walter's chief difficulty was how to break the change in his affairs to Uncle Saul, to whom he was sensible it would be a terrible blow. He had the greater difficulty in dashing Uncle Saul's spirits with such an astounding piece of intelligence, because they had lately recovered very much, and the old man had become so cheerful that the little back parlor was itself again. Uncle Saul had paid the first appointed portion of the debt to Mr. Donbilly, and was hopeful of working his way through the rest, and to cast him down afresh when he had sprung up so manfully from his troubles was a very distressing necessity. Yet it would never do to run away from him. He must know of it beforehand, and how to tell him was the point. As to the question of going or not going, Walter did not consider that he had any power of choice in the matter. Mr. Donby had truly told him that he was young, and that Uncle's circumstances were not good, and Mr. Dobby had plainly expressed in the glance with which he had accompanied that reminder that if he declined to go he might stay at home if he chose, but not in his counting house, his uncle, and he lay under a great obligation to Mr. Dobby, which was of Walter's own soliciting. He might have begun in secret to despair of ever winning that gentleman's favor, and might have thought that he was now and then disposed to put a slight upon him, which was hardly just, but what would have been duty. Without that was still duty with it, or Walter thought so, and duty must be done. When Mr. Dobby had looked at him and told him he was young and that his uncle's circumstances were not good, there had been an expression of disdain in his face, a contemptuous and disparaging assumption that he would be quite content to live idly on a reduced old man, which stung the boy's generous soul, determined to assure Mr. Damban so far as it was possible to give him the assurance, without expressing it in words, that indeed he mistook his nature. Walter had been anxious to show even more cheerfulness and activity after the West Indian interview than he had shown before, if it were possible, in one of his quick and zealous disposition. He was too young and inexperienced to think that possibly this very quality in him was not agreeable to Mr. Dobby, and that it was no stepping stone to his good opinion to be elastic and hopeful of pleasing under the shadow of his powerful displeasure, whether it were right or wrong. But it may have been that the great man thought himself defied in this new exposition of an honest spirit and purpose to bring it down well at last, and at least Uncle Sol must be told, thought Walter with a sigh, and as Walter was apprehensive that his voice might perhaps quaver a little, and that his countenance might not be quite as hopeful as he could wish it to be, if he told the old man himself, and saw the first effects of his communication on his wrinkled face, he resolved to avail himself of the services of that powerful mediator, Captain Cuttle. Sunday coming round, he set off, therefore, after breakfast once more to beat up Captain Cuttle's quarters. It was not unpleasant to remember on the way thither that Mrs. McStinger resorted to a great distance every Sunday morning to attend the ministry of the Reverend Melchizedek Howler, who, having been one day discharged from the work missed India docks on a false suspicion, got up expressly against him by the general enemy of screwing gimlets into punctures and applying his lips to the orifice, had announced the destruction of the world for that day, 2 years at 10 in the morning, and opened a front parlor for the reception of ladies and gentlemen of the ranting persuasion, upon whom on the first occasion of that assemblage the admonitions of the Reverend Melchizedek had produced so powerful an effect that in their rapturous performance of a sacred jig, which closed the service, the whole flock broke through into a kitchen below and disabled a mangle belonging to one of the fold. This the captain, in a moment of uncommon conviviality, had confided to Walter and his uncle. Between the repetitions of Lovely Peg on the night when Brogley the broker was paid out, the captain himself was punctual in his attendance at a church in his own neighborhood, which hosted the Union Jack every Sunday morning, and where he was good enough, the lawful beadle being infirm, to keep an eye upon the boys, over whom he exercised great power in virtue of his mysterious hook. Knowing the regularity of the captain's habits, Walter made all the haste he could that he might anticipate his going out, and he made such good speed that he had the pleasure, on turning into Brick Place, to behold the broad blue coat and waistcoat hanging out of the captain's open window to air in the sun. It appeared incredible that the coat and waistcoat could be seen by mortal eyes without the captain, but he certainly was not in them, otherwise his legs, the houses in Brick Place not being lofty, would have obstructed The street door, which was perfectly clear. Quite wondering at this discovery, Walter gave a single knock stinger. He distinctly heard the captain say up in his room, as if that were no business of his. Therefore Walter gave to Knock's cuddle. He heard the captain say upon that, and immediately afterwards the captain in his clean shirt and braces, with his neckcloth hanging loosely around his throat like a coil of rope, and his glazed hat on, appeared at the window leaning out over the broad blue coat and waistcoat. Waller, cried the captain, looking down upon him in amazement. Aye, Captain Cuddle, returned Walter. Only me. What's the matter, my lad? Inquired the captain, with great concern. Gill's aunt and Bean, and sprung nothing again. No, said Walter, my uncle's all right, Captain Cuddle. The captain expressed his gratification, and said he would come down below and open the door, which he did. Though you're early, Waller, said the captain, eyeing him still doubtfully, when they got upstairs. Why, the fact is, Captain Cuddle, said Walter, sitting down, I was afraid you would have gone out, and I want to benefit by your friendly counsel. So you shall, said the captain. What will you take? I want to take your opinion, Captain Cuddle, returned Walter, smiling. That's the only thing for me. Come on then, said the captain with a will. My lad. Walter related to him what had happened, and the difficulty in which he felt respecting his uncle, and the relief it would be to him if Captain Cuddle in his kindness would help him to smooth it away. Captain Cuddle's infinite consternation and astonishment at the prospect unfolded to him, gradually swallowing that gentleman up until it left his face quite vacant, and the suit of blue, the glazed hat, and the hook apparently without an owner. You see, Captain Cuddle, pursued Walter, for myself I am young, as Mr. Dombey said, and not to be considered. I am to fight my way through the world, I know, but there are 2 points I was thinking as I came along that I should be very particular about in respect to my uncle. I don't mean to say that I deserve to be the pride and delight of his life, you believe me, I know, but I am now. Don't you think I am? The captain seemed to make an endeavor to rise from the depths of his astonishment and get back to his face, but the effort being ineffectual, the glazed hat merely nodded with a mute, unutterable meaning. If I live and have my health, said Walter, and I am not afraid of that still, when I leave England, I can hardly hope to see my uncle again. He is old, Captain Cuddle, and besides, his life is a life of custom. Steady, Waller, of a wand of custom, said the captain, suddenly reappearing. To true, returned Walter, shaking his head, but I meant a life of habit, Captain Cuddle, that sort of custom, and if, as you very truly said, I am sure he would have died the sooner for the loss of the stock and all those objects to which he had become accustomed for so many years. Don't you think he might die a little sooner for the loss of his nevy? Interposed the captain. Right, well then, said Walter, trying to speak gaily, we must do our best to make him believe that the separation is but a temporary one after all. But as I know better, or dread that I know better, Captain Cuddle, and as I have so many reasons for regarding him with affection and duty and honor, I am afraid I should make but a very poor hand at that if I tried to persuade him of it. That's my great reason for wishing you to break it out to him, and that's the first point. Keep her off a point or so, observed the captain in a contemplative voice. What did you say, Captain Cuddle? Inquired Walter. Stand by, returned the captain thoughtfully. Walter paused to ascertain if the captain had any particular information to add to this, but as he said no more, went on. Now the second point, Captain Cuddle. I am sorry to say I am not a favorite with Mr. Dombey. I have always tried to do my best, and I have always done it, but he does not. Like me, he can't help his likings and dislikings. Perhaps I say nothing of that. I only say that I am certain he does not like me. He does not send me to this post as a good one. He disclaims to represent it as being better than it is, and I doubt very much if it will ever lead me to advancement in the house. Whether it does not, on the contrary, dispose of me forever and put me out of the way. Now we must say nothing of this to my uncle, Captain Cuddle, but must make it out to be as favorable and promising as we can. And when I tell you what it really is, I only do so that in case any means should ever arise of lending me a hand so far off, I may have one friend at home who knows my real situation. Water, my boy, replied the captain. In the Proverbs of Solomon, you will find the following words: may we never want a friend in need, nor a bottle to give him when found. Make a note of here. The captain stretched out his hand to Walter with an air of downright good faith that spoke volumes. at the same time repeating, for he felt proud of the accuracy and pointed application of his quotation. When found, make a note of Captain Cuddle, said Walter, taking the immense fist extended to him by the captain in both his hands, which it completely filled. Next to my Uncle Saul, I love you. There is no one on earth in whom I can more safely trust, I am sure, as to the mere going away. Captain Cuddle, I don't care for that. Why should I care for that? If I were free to seek my own fortune, if I were free to go as a common sailor, if I were free to venture on my own account to the farthest end of the world, I would gladly go. I would have gladly gone years ago and taken my chance of what might come of it. But it was against my uncle's wishes and against the plans he had formed for me, and there was an end of that. But what I feel, Captain Cuddle, is that we have been a little mistaken all along, and that so far as any improvement in my prospects is concerned, I am no better off now than I was when I first entered Dobby's house. Perhaps a little worse, for the house may have been kindly inclined towards me then, and it certainly is not now. Turn again, Whittington, muttered the disconsolate captain, after looking at Walter for some time. I replied, Walter, laughing, and turned a great many times to Captain Cuddle. I'm afraid before such fortune as is ever turns up again. Not that I complain, he added in his lively, animated, energetic way. I have nothing to complain of. I am provided for. I can live. When I leave my uncle, I leave him to you, and I can leave him to no one better. Captain Cuddle, I haven't told you all this because I despair not. It's to convince you that I can't pick and choose in Dobby's house, and that where I am sent there I must go, and when I am offered that I must take. It's better for my uncle that I should be sent away from. Mr. Dobby is a valuable friend to him, as he proved himself, you know, when Captain Cuddle, and I am persuaded he won't be less valuable when he hasn't me there every day to awaken his dislike. So hurrah for the West Indies. Captain Cuddle, how does that tune go that the sailors sing for the last line, reaching the quick ears of an ardent skipper not quite sober, who lodged opposite, and who instantly sprang out of bed, threw up his window, and joined in across the street. At the top of his voice produced a fine effect. When it was impossible to sustain the concluding note any longer, the skipper bellowed forth a terrific ahoy, intended in part as a friendly greeting, and in part to show that he was not at all breath. That done, he shut down his window and went to bed again. And now, Captain Cuddle, said Walter, handing him the blue coat and waistcoat and bustling very much, if you'll come and break the news to Uncle Saul, which he ought to have known days upon days ago by rights, I'll leave you at the door, you know, and walk about until the afternoon. The captain, however, scarcely appeared to relish the commission, or to be by any means confident of his powers of executing it. He had arranged the future life and adventures of Walter so very differently, and so entirely to his own satisfaction. He had felicitated himself so often on the sagacity and foresight displayed in that arrangement, and had found it so complete and perfect in all its parts, that to suffer it to go to pieces all at once, and even to assist in breaking it up, required a great effort of his resolution. The captain found it difficult to unload his old ideas upon the subject, and to take a perfectly new cargo on board with that rapidity which the circumstances required, or without jumbling and confounding the two. Consequently, instead of putting on his coat and waistcoat with anything like the impetuosity that could alone have kept pace with Walter's mood, he declined to invest himself with those garments at all at present, and informed Walter that on such a serious matter he must be allowed to bite his nails. But it's an old habit of mine, Walter, said the captain, any time these 50 year, when you see Ned Cuddle bite his nails, Walter, then you may know that Ned Cuddle's aground. Thereupon the captain put his iron hook between his teeth as if it were a hand, and with an air of wisdom and profundity that was the very concentration and sublimation of all philosophical reflection and grave inquiry, applied himself to the consideration of the subject in its various branches. There's a friend of mine, murmured the captain in an absent manner, but he's at present coasting round a Whitby that would deliver such an opinion on this subject, or any other that could be named, as would give Polyamort 6 and beat him. Been knocked overboard, that man, said the captain, twice. None the worse for it. Was beat in his apprenticeship for 3 weeks off, and on about the head with a ring bolt, and yet a clear-minded man don't walk. Despite of his respect for Captain Cuddle, Walter could not help inwardly rejoicing at the absence of the sage, and devoutly hoping that his limpid intellect might not be brought to bear on his difficulties until they were quite settled, if he was to take and show that man the boy at the Noor, said Captain Cuddle in the same tone, and ask him his opinion of it. Walter, he'd give you an opinion that was no more like that boy than your uncle's buttons are. There ain't a man that walks, certainly not on two legs, that can come near him, not near him. What's his name? Captain Cuddle inquired Walter, determined to be interested in the captain's friend. His name's Bunsby, said the captain. But Lord, it might be anything for the matter of that, with such a mind as is the exact idea which the captain attached to this concluding piece of praise. He did not further elucidate, neither did Walter seek to draw it forth, for on his beginning to review, with the vivacity natural to himself and to his situation, the leading points in his own affairs, he soon discovered that the captain had relapsed into his former profound state of mind, and that while he eyed him steadfastly from beneath his bushy eyebrows, he evidently neither saw nor heard him, but remained immersed in cogitation. In fact, Captain Cuddle was laboring with such great designs that, far from being aground, he soon got off into the deepest of water and could find no bottom to his penetration. By degrees, it became perfectly plain to the captain that there was some mistake here, that it was undoubtedly much more likely to be Walter's mistake than his, that if there were really any West India scheme afoot, it was a very different one from what Walter, who was young and rash, supposed, and could only be some new device for making his fortune with unusual celerity. Or if there should be any little hitch between them, thought the captain, meaning Walter and Mr. Dombey, it only wants a word in season from a friend of both parties to set it right and smooth it and make it all taut. Again, Captain Cuddle's deduction from these considerations was that as he already enjoyed the pleasure of knowing Mr. Dombey from having spent a very agreeable half-hour in his company at Brighton on the morning when they borrowed the money, and that as a couple of men of the world who understood each other and were mutually disposed to making things comfortable, could easily arrange any little difficulty of this sort and come at the real facts, the friendly thing for him to do would be, without saying anything about it to Walter at present, just to step up to Mr. Dombey's house, say to the servant, would he be so good, my lad, as to report Captain Cuddle here, meet Mr. Dombey in a confidential spirit, hook him by the buttonhole, talk it over, make it all right, and come away triumphant. As these reflections presented themselves to the captain's mind, and by slow degrees assumed the shape and form, his visage cleared like a doubtful morning when it gives place to a bright noon. His eyebrows, which had been in the highest degree portentous, smoothed their rugged bristling aspect and became serene. His eyes, which had been nearly closed in the severity of his mental exercise, opened freely. A smile, which had been at first but 3 specks, one at the right hand cornered of his mouth and one at the corner of each eye, gradually overspread his whole face, and rippling up into his forehead lifted the glazed hat, as if that too had been aground with Captain Cuddle, and were now like him happily afloat again. Finally, the captain left off biting his nails and said, now, Waller, my boy, you may help me on with them slops, by which the captain meant his coat and waistcoat. Walter little imagined why the captain was so particular in the arrangement of his cravat as to twist the pendant ends into a sort of pigtail and pass them through a massive gold ring with a picture of a tomb upon it and a neat iron railing and a tree in memory of some deceased friend, nor why the captain pulled up his shirt collar to the utmost limits allowed by the Irish linen below, and by so doing decorated himself with a complete pair of blinkers, nor why he changed his shoes and put on an unparalleled pair of ankle jacks, which he only wore on extraordinary occasions, the captain being at length attired to his own complete satisfaction, and having glanced at himself from head to foot in a shaving glass, which he removed from a nail for that purpose, took up his knotted stick and said he was ready. The captain's walk was more complacent than usual when they got out into the street, but this Walter supposed to be the effect of the ankle jacks, and took little heed. Before they had gone very far, they encountered a woman selling flowers, when the captain, stopping short as if struck by a happy idea, made a purchase of the largest bundle in her basket, a most glorious nosegay, fan shaped some 2 feet and a half round, and composed of all the jolliest looking flowers that blow. Armed with this little token, which he designed for Mr. Dombey, Captain Cuddle walked on with Walter until they reached the instrument maker's door, before which they both paused. You're going in, said Walter. Yes, returned the captain, who felt that Walter must be got rid of before he proceeded any further, and that he had better time his projected visit somewhat later in the day. "And you won't forget anything, no," returned the captain. "I'll go upon my walk at once," said Walter. "And then I shall be out of the way, Captain Cuddle. Take a good long run, my lad," replied the captain, calling after him. Walter waved his hand in assent and went his way. His way was nowhere in particular, but he thought he would go out into the fields, where he could reflect upon the unknown life before him, and resting under some tree ponder quietly. He knew no better fields than those near Hampstead, and no better means of getting at them than by passing Mr. Dobby's house. It was as stately and as dark as ever when he went by and glanced up at its frowning front. The blinds were all pulled down, but the upper windows stood wide open, and the pleasant air stirring those curtains and waving them to and fro was the only sign of animation in the whole exterior. Walter walked softly as he passed, and was glad when he had left the house a door or two behind. He looked back then with the interest he had always felt for the place since the adventure of the lost child years ago, and looked especially at those upper windows. While he was thus engaged, a chariot drove to the door, and a portly gentleman in black with a heavy watch chain alighted and went in. When he afterwards remembered this gentleman and his equipage together, Walter had no doubt he was a physician, and then he wondered who was ill, but the discovery did not occur to him until he had walked some distance, thinking listlessly of other things, though still of what the house had suggested to him. For Walter pleased himself with thinking that perhaps the time might come when the beautiful child, who was his old friend and had always been so grateful to him and so glad to see him since, might interest her brother in his behalf and influence his fortunes for the better. He liked to imagine this more at the moment for the pleasure of imagining her continued remembrance of him than for any worldly profit he might gain. But another, a more sober fancy, whispered to him that if he were alive, then he would be beyond the sea and forgotten. She married, rich, proud, happy. There was no more reason why she should remember him with any interest in such an altered state of things than any plaything she ever had known. Not so much yet Walter so idealized the pretty child whom he had found wandering in the rough streets, and so identified her with her innocent gratitude of that night, and the simplicity and truth of its expression, that he blushed for himself as a libeler when he argued that she could ever grow proud. On the other hand, his meditations were of that fantastic order that it seemed hardly less libelous in him to imagine her grown a woman, to think of her as anything but the same artless, gentle, winning little creature that she had been in the days of good Mrs. Brown. In a word, Walter found out that no reason within himself about Florence at all was to become very unreasonable indeed, and that he could do no better than preserve her image in his mind as something precious, unattainable, unchangeable, and indefinite in all but its power of giving him pleasure and restraining him like an angel's hand from anything unworthy. It was a long stroll in the fields that Walter took that day, listening to the birds and the Sunday bells and the softened murmur of the town, breathing sweet scents, glancing sometimes at the dim horizon beyond which his voyage and his place of destination lay, then looking round on the green English grass on the home landscape. But he hardly once thought even of going away distinctly, and seemed to put off reflection idly from hour to hour and from minute to minute. While he yet went on reflecting all the time, Walter had left the fields behind him and was plodding homeward in the same abstracted mood, when he heard a shout from a man, and then a woman's voice calling to him loudly by name. Turning quickly in his surprise, he saw that a hackney coach going in the contrary direction had stopped at no great distance, that the coachman was looking back from his box and making signals to him with his whip, and that a young woman inside was leaning out of the window and beckoning with immense energy. Running up to this coach, he found that the young woman was Miss Snipper, and that Miss Snipper was in such a flutter as to be almost beside herself. "Stag's his gardens, Mr. Walter," said Miss Snipper. "If you please, I'll do." "Hey," cried Walter. "What is the matter, oh, Mr. Walter?" "Tags his gardens, if you please," said Susan. "There," cried the coachman, appealing to Walter with a sort of exulting despair. "That's the way the young lady's been a-going on for upwards of a mortal hour, and me continually backing out of no fair affairs where she would drive up. I've had a many fares in this coach, first and last, but never such a fare as her." "Do you want to go to Stag's Garden?" Susan inquired Walter. "Ah, she wants to go there." "Where is it?" growled the coachman. "I don't know where it is," exclaimed Susan wildly. "Mr. Wall, I was There once myself along with Miss Floy and our poor darling Master Paul on the very day when you found Miss Floy in the city, for we lost her coming home. Mrs. Richards, me, and a mad bull and Mrs. Richards' eldest, and though I went there afterwards, I can't remember where it is. I think it sunk into the ground. Oh, Mr. Walter, don't desert me, Staggs's Gardens, if you please. Miss Floy's darling, all our darlings, little meek Master Poe. Oh, Mr. Walter, good God, cried Walter, is he very ill? The pretty flower, cried Susan, wringing her hands, has took the fancy that he'd like to see his old nurse, and I've come to bring her to his bedside. Mrs. Staggs of Polly Toodle's Gardens. Someone pray, greatly moved by what he heard, and catching Susan's earnestness immediately, Walter, now that he understood the nature of her errand, dashed into it with such ardor that the coachman had enough to do to follow closely as he ran before, inquiring here and there and everywhere the way to Staggs's Gardens. There was no such place as Staggs's Gardens. It had vanished from the earth where the old rotten summer houses once stood. Palaces now reared their heads, and granite columns of gigantic girth opened a vista to the railway world beyond. The miserable wasteland where the refuse matter had been heaped of yore was swallowed up and gone, and in its frowsy stead were tiers of warehouses crammed with rich goods and costly merchandise. The old by streets now swarmed with passengers and vehicles of every kind. The new streets that had stopped disheartened in the mud and wagon ruts formed towns within themselves, originating wholesome comforts and conveniences belonging to themselves and never tried nor thought of until they sprung into existence. Bridges that had LED to nothing, LED to villas, gardens, churches, healthy public walks, the carcasses of houses and beginnings of new thoroughfares had started off upon the line at steam's own speed and shot away into the country in a monster train. As to the neighborhood which had hesitated to acknowledge the railroad in its straggling days, that had grown wise and penitent as any Christian might in such a case, and now boasted of its powerful and prosperous relation, there were railway patterns in its drapers' shops and railway journals in the windows of its newsmen. There were railway hotels, office houses, lodging houses, boarding houses, railway plans, maps, views, wrappers, bottles, sandwich boxes, and timetables, railway hackney coach and stands, railway omnibuses, railway streets and buildings, railway hangers-on and parasites and flatterers out of all calculation. There was even railway time observed in clocks, as if the sun itself had given in. Among the vanquished was the master chimney sweeper Willem, incredulous at Staggs's Gardens, who now lived in a stuccoed house 3 stories high and gave himself out with golden flourishes upon a varnished board as contractor for the cleansing of railway chimneys by machinery to and from the heart of this great change. All day and night throbbing currents rushed and returned incessantly, like its life's blood, crowds of people and mountains of goods departing and arriving scores upon scores of times in every 4 and 20 hours produced a fermentation in the place that was always in action. The very houses seemed disposed to pack up and take trips. Wonderful members of Parliament, who little more than 20 years before had made themselves merry with the wild railroad theories of engineers and given them the liveliest rubs in cross-examination, went down into the north with their watches in their hands and sent on messages before by the electric telegraph to say that they were coming. Night and day the conquering engines rumbled at their distant work or advancing smoothly to their journey's end and gliding like tamed dragons into the allotted corners grooved out to the inch for their reception, stood bubbling and trembling there, making the walls quake as if they were dilating with the secret knowledge of great powers yet unsuspected in them and strong purposes not yet achieved. But Staggs's Gardens had been cut up root and branch. Oh, woe the day when not a rod of English ground laid out in Staggs's Gardens is secure at last. After much fruitless inquiry, Walter, followed by the coach and Susan, found a man who had once resided in that vanished land and who was no other than the master sweep before referred to, grown stout, and knocking a double knock at his own door. He no doodle, he said, well belonged to the railroad, didn't he? Yes, sir, yes, cried Susan Nipper from the coach window. Where did he live now? Hastily inquired Walter. He lived in the company's own buildings, second, turning to the right down the yard, cross over and take the second on the right again. It was no 11, they couldn't mistake it. But if they did, they had only to ask for Tootle engine fireman and anyone would show them which was his house. At this unexpected stroke of success, Susan Nipper dismounted from the coach, with all speed took Walter's arm and set off at a breathless pace on foot, leaving the coach there to await their return. "Has the little boy been long ill?" Susan inquired Walter, as they hurried on, ailing for a deal of time. "But no one knew how much," said Susan, adding with excessive sharpness, "All them blimbers." "Blimbers," echoed Walter. "I couldn't forgive myself at such a time as this, Mr. Walter," said Susan, "when there's so much serious distress to think about. If I rested hard on anyone, especially on them that little darling Paul speaks well of. But I may wish that the family was set to work in a stony soil to make new roads." And then Miss Blimber went in front and had the pickaxe. Miss Snipper then took breath and went on faster than before, as if this extraordinary aspiration had relieved her. Walter, who had by this time no breath of his own to spare, hurried along without asking any more questions, and they soon in their impatience burst in at a little door and came into a clean parlor full of children. "Where's Mrs. Richards?" exclaimed Susan Nipper, looking round. "Oh, Mrs. Richards, Mrs. Richards, come along with me, my dear creature." "Why, if it ain't Susan," cried Polly, rising with her honest face and motherly figure from among the group in great surprise. "Yes, Mrs. Richards, it's me," said Susan, "and I wish it wasn't, though I may not seem to flatter when I say so. But little Master Paul is very ill and told his part today that he would like to see the face of his whole nurse and him and Miss Floy. Hope he'll come along with me and Mr. Walter." Mrs. Richards, forgetting what was past, and do a kindness to the sweet dear that is withering away. "Oh, Mrs. Richards, withering away." Susan Nipper crying. Polly shed tears to see her and to hear what she had said, and all the children gathered round, including numbers of new babies and Mr. Tootle, who had just come home from Birmingham and was eating his dinner out of a basin, laid down his knife and fork and put on his wife's bonnet and shawl for her, which were hanging up behind the door, then tapped her on the back and said with more fatherly feeling than eloquence, "Polly, cut away." So they got back to the coach long before the coachman expected them, and Walter, putting Susan and Mrs. Richards inside, took his seat on the box himself, that there might be no more mistakes, and deposited them safely in the hall of Mr. Dobby's house, where by the by he saw a mighty nosegay lying, which reminded him of the one Captain Cuttle had purchased in his company that morning. He would have lingered to know more of the young invalid, or waited any length of time to see if he could lend the least service, but painfully sensible that such conduct would be looked upon by Mr. Domboy as presumptuous and forward, he turned slowly, sadly, anxiously away. He had not gone 5 minutes' walk from the door when a man came running after him and begged him to return. Walter retraced his steps as quickly as he could and entered the gloomy house with a sorrowful foreboding. Chapter 16. What the waves were always saying. Paul had never risen from his little bed. He lay there listening to the noises in the street quite tranquilly, not caring much how the time went, but watching it and watching everything about him with observing eyes, when the sunbeam struck into his room through the rustling blinds and quivered on the opposite wall like golden water. He knew that evening was coming on, and that the sky was red and beautiful. As the reflection died away and a gloom went creeping up the wall, he watched it deepen, deepen, deepen into night. Then he thought how the long streets were dotted with lamps, and how the peaceful stars were shining overhead. His fancy had a strange tendency to wander to the river, which he knew was flowing through the great city, and now he thought how black it was and how deep it would look, reflecting the hosts of stars, and more than all how steadily it rolled away to meet the sea as it grew later in the night, and footsteps in the street became so rare that he could hear them coming, count them as they passed, and lose them. In the hollow distance he would lie and watch the many-colored ring about the candle, and wait patiently for day. His only trouble was the swift and rapid river. He felt forced sometimes to try to stop it, to stem it with his childish hands, or choke its way with sand, and when he saw it coming on resistless, he cried out. But a word from Florence, who was always at his side, restored him to himself, and leaning his poor head upon her breast, he told Floy of his dream, and smiled. When day began to dawn again, he watched for the sun, and when its cheerful light began to sparkle in the room he pictured to himself, he saw the high church towers rising up into the morning sky, the town reviving, waking, starting into life once more. The river glistening as it rolled, but rolling fast as ever, and the country bright with dew. Familiar sounds and cries came by degrees into the street below. The servants in the house were roused, and busy faces looked in at the door, and voices asked his attendants softly how he was. Paul always answered for himself, "I am better, I am a great deal better, thank you, tell Papa so." By little and little he got tired of the bustle of the day, the noise of carriages and carts and people passing and repassing, and would fall asleep or be troubled with a restless and uneasy sense. Again, the child could hardly tell whether this were in his sleeping or his waking moments of that rushing river. "Why will it never stop, Floyd?" he would sometimes ask. "Hurt is bearing me away, I think." But Floyd could always soothe and reassure him, and it was his daily delight to make her lay her head down on his pillow and take some rest. "You are always watching me, Floyd, let me watch you." Now they would prop him up with cushions in a corner of his bed, and there he would recline the while she lay beside him, bending forward oftentimes to kiss her, and whispering to those who were near that she was tired, and how she had sat up so many nights beside him. Thus, the flush of the day and its heat and light would gradually decline, and again the golden water would be dancing on the wall. He was visited by as many as 3 grave doctors. They used to assemble downstairs and come up together, and the room was so quiet, and Paul was so observant of them, though he never asked of anybody what they said, that he even knew the difference in the sound of their watches. But his interest centered in Sir Parker Peps, who always took his seat on the side of the bed. For Paul had heard them say long ago that that gentleman had been with his mama when she clasped Florence in her arms and died, and he couldn't forget it. Now he liked him, for he was not afraid the people round him changed as unaccountably as on that first night at Dr. Bleember's. Except Florence. Florence never changed. And what had been Sir Parker Peps was now his father, sitting with his head upon his hand, old Mrs. Peepchin dozing in an easy chair, often changed to Miss Tokes or his aunt, and Paul was quite content to shut his eyes again and see what happened next without emotion. But this figure with its head upon its hand returned so often, and remained so long, and sat so still and solemn, never speaking, never being spoken to, and rarely lifting up its face, that Paul began to wonder languidly if it were real, and in the night time saw it sitting there with fear. "Floy," he said, "what is that? Where, dearest?" "There at the bottom of the bed. There's nothing there except Papa." The figure lifted up its head and rose, and coming to the bedside, said, "My own boy, don't you know me?" Paul looked it in the face, and thought, was this his father? But the face so halted to his thinking, thrilled while he gazed as if it were in pain, and before he could reach out both his hands to take it in between them and draw it towards him, the figure turned away quickly from the little bed and went out at the door. Paul looked at Florence with a fluttering heart, but he knew what she was going to say, and stopped her with his face against her lips. The next time he observed the figure sitting at the bottom of the bed, he called to it, "Don't be sorry for me, dear Papa. Indeed, I am quite happy." His father coming and bending down to him, which he did quickly and without first pausing by the bedside, Paul held him round the neck and repeated those words to him several times and very earnestly. And Paul never saw him in his room again at any time, whether it were day or night. But he called out, "Don't be sorry for me. Indeed, I am quite happy." This was the beginning of his always saying in the morning that he was a great deal better, and that they were to tell his father so. How many times the golden water danced upon the wall, how many nights the dark, dark river rolled towards the sea. In spite of him, Paul never counted, never sought to know if their kindness or his sense of it could have increased. They were more kind, and he more grateful every day. But whether they were many days or few appeared of little moment now to the gentle boy. One night he had been thinking of his mother and her picture in the drawing room downstairs, and thought she must have loved sweet Florence better than his father did to have held her in her arms when she felt that she was dying. For even he, her brother, who had such dear love for her, could have no greater wish than that. The train of thought suggested to him to inquire if he had ever seen his mother, for he could not remember whether they had told him yes or no. The river running very fast and confusing his mind. "Floyd, did I ever see Mama?" "No, darling. Why did I ever see any kind face like Mama's looking at me when I was a baby?" "Floyd," he asked incredulously, as if he had some vision of a face before him. "Oh yes, dear. Who's Fly? Your old nurse's often." "And where is my old nurse?" said Paul. "Is she dead to Fly? Are we all dead except you?" There was a hurry in the room for an instant longer perhaps, but it seemed no more than all was still again, and Florence, with her face quite colorless, but smiling, held his head upon her arm. Her arm trembled very much. "Show me that old nurse, Floy, if you please. She's not here, darling. She shall come tomorrow." "Thank you, Floy." Paul closed his eyes with those words and fell asleep. When he awoke, the sun was high and the broad day was clear, and he lay a little looking at the windows, which were open, and the curtains rustling in the air and waving to and fro. Then he said, "Floy, is it tomorrow? Is she come?" Someone seemed to go in quest of her. Perhaps it was Susan. Paul thought he heard her telling him, when he had closed his eyes again, that she would soon be back, but he did not open them to see she kept her word. Perhaps she had never been away. But the next thing that happened was a noise of footsteps on the stairs, and then Paul woke mind and body, and sat upright in his bed. He saw them now about him. There was no gray mist before them, as there had been sometimes in the night. He knew them, everyone, and called them by their names. "And who is this?" "Is this my old nurse?" said the child, regarding with a radiant smile a figure coming in. Yes, yes, no other stranger would have shed those tears at sight of him and called him her dear boy, her pretty boy, her own poor blighted child. No other woman would have stooped down by his bed and taken up his wasted hand and put it to her lips and breast as one who had some right to fondle it. No other woman would have so forgotten everybody there but him and Floy, and been so full of tenderness and pity. "Floy, this is a kind, good face," said Paul. "I am glad to see it again. Don't go away, old nurse. Stay here." His senses were all quickened, and he heard a name. He knew who was that. "Who said Walter?" he asked, looking round. Someone said, "Walter, is he here? I should like to see him very much." Nobody replied directly, but his father soon said to Susan, "Call him back, then let him come up." After a short pause of expectation, during which he looked with smiling interest and wonder on his nurse, and saw that she had not forgotten Floy, Walter was brought into the room. His open face and manner, and his cheerful eyes had always made him a favorite with Paul, and when Paul saw him, he stretched out his hand and said, "Goodbye." "Goodbye, my child," said Mrs. Peepchin, hurrying to his bed's head. Not goodbye for an instant. Paul looked at her with the wistful face with which he had so often gazed upon her in his corner by the fire. "Yes," he said placidly. "Goodbye, Walter dear, goodbye," turning his head to where he stood and putting out his hand again. "Where's Papa?" He felt his father's breath upon his cheek before the words had parted from his lips. "Remember Walter dear, Papa," he whispered, looking in his face. "Remember Walter. I was fond of Walter." The feeble hand waved in the air as if it cried goodbye to Walter once again. "Now lay me down," he said, "and Floy, come close to me, and let me see you." Sister and brother wound their arms around each other, and the golden light came streaming in and fell upon them locked together. "How fast the river runs between its green banks, and the rushes, Floy, but it's very near the sea. I hear the waves," they always said. So presently he told her the motion of the boat upon the stream was lulling him to rest. How green the banks were now, how bright the flowers growing on them, and how tall the rushes. Now the boat was out at sea, but gliding smoothly on, and now there was a shore before him, who stood on the bank. He put his hands together as he had been used to do at his prayer. He did not remove his arms to do it, but they saw him fold them so behind her neck. "Mama is like you, Floy. I know her by her face, but tell them that the print upon the stairs at school is not divine enough. The light about the head is shining on me as I go." The golden ripple on the wall came back again, and nothing else stirred in the room. "The old fashion, the fashion that came in with our first garments and will last unchanged until our race has run its course and the wide firmament is rolled up like a scroll. The old-fashioned death. Oh, thank God all who see it for that older fashion, yet of immortality, and look upon us angels of young children with regards not quite estranged when the swift river bears us to the ocean." "Dear me to think," said Miss Tox, bursting out afresh that night as if her heart were broken, "that Toby and Son should be her daughter after all." Chapter 17. Captain Cuttle does a little business for the young people. Captain Cuttle, in the exercise of that surprising talent for deep-laid and unfathomable scheming with which is not unusual in men of transparent simplicity, he sincerely believed himself to be endowed by nature, had gone to Mr. Dobby's house on the eventful Sunday, winking all the way as event for his superfluous sagacity, and had presented himself in the full luster of the ankle jacks before the eyes of Tomlinson, hearing from that individual, to his great concern, of the impending calamity, Captain Cuttle in his delicacy sheared off again, confounded, merely handing in the nosegay as a small mark of his solicitude, and leaving his respectful compliments for the family in general, which he accompanied with an expression of his hope that they would lay their heads well to the wind under existing circumstances, and a friendly intimation that he would look up again tomorrow. The captain's compliments were never heard of any more. The captain's nosegay, after lying in the hall all night, was swept into the dustbin next morning, and the captain's sly arrangement involved in one catastrophe with greater hopes and loftier designs was crushed to pieces. So, when an avalanche bears down a mountain, forest twigs and bush suffer with the trees, and all perish together. When Walter returned home on the Sunday evening from his long walk and its memorable close, he was much too occupied at first by the tidings he had to give them, and by the emotions naturally awakened in his breast by the scene through which he had passed, to observe either that his uncle was evidently unacquainted with the intelligence the captain had undertaken to impart, or that the captain made signals with his hook warning him to avoid the subject. Not that the captain's signals were calculated to have proved very comprehensible, however attentively observed, for like those Chinese sages who are set in their conferences to write certain learned words in the air that are wholly impossible of pronunciation, the captain made such waves and flourishes as nobody without a previous knowledge of his mystery would have been at all likely to understand. Captain Cuttle, however, becoming cognizant of what had happened, relinquished these attempts as he perceived the slender chance that now existed of his being able to obtain a little easy chat with Mr. Dombey before the period of Walter's departure. But in admitting to himself with a disappointed and crestfallen countenance that Sol Gills must be told, and that Walter must go, taking the case for the present as he found it, and not having it enlightened or improved beforehand by the knowing management of a friend, the captain still felt an unabated confidence that he, Ned Cuttle, was the man for Mr. Dombey, and that to set Walter's fortunes quite square nothing was wanted, but that they two should come together, for the captain never could forget how well he and Mr. Dombey had got on at Brighton, with what nicety each of them had put in a word when it was wanted, how exactly they had taken one another's measure, nor how Ned Cuttle had pointed out that resource in the first extremity, and had brought the interview to the desired termination. On all these grounds the captain soothed himself with thinking that though Ned Cuttle was forced by the pressure of events to stand by, almost useless for the present, Ned would fetch up with a wet sail in good time and carry all before him. Under the influence of this good-natured delusion, Captain Cuttle even went so far as to resolve in his own bosom, while he sat looking at Walter and listening with a tear on his shirt collar to what he related, whether it might be not at once gentile and politic to give Mr. Dombey a verbal invitation whenever they should meet to come and cut his mutton in Brig Place on some day of his own naming, and enter on the question of his young friend's prospects over a social glass. But the uncertain temper of Mrs. McStinger, and the possibility of her setting up rest in the passage during such an entertainment, and their delivering some homily of an uncomplimentary nature, operated as a check on the captain's hospitable thoughts, and rendered him timid of giving them encouragement. One fact was quite clear to the captain, as Walter, sitting thoughtfully over his untasted dinner, dwelt on all that had happened, namely, that however Walter's modesty might stand in the way of his perceiving it himself, he was, as one might say, a member of Mr. Dombey's family. He had been in his own person connected with the incident he so pathetically described. He had been by name remembered and commended in close association with it, and his fortunes must have a particular interest in his employer's eyes. If the captain had any lurking doubt whatever of his own conclusions, he had not the least doubt that they were good conclusions for the peace of mind of the instrument maker. Therefore he availed himself of so favorable a moment for breaking the West Indian intelligence to his friend as a piece of extraordinary preferment, declaring that for his part he would freely give £100,000 if he had it for Walter's gain in the long run, and that he had no doubt such an investment would yield a handsome premium. Solomon Gills was at first stunned by the communication, which fell upon the little back parlor like a thunderbolt, and tore up the hearth savagely, but the captain flashed such golden prospects before his dim sight, hinted so mysteriously at Whittingtonian consequences, laid such emphasis on what Walter had just now told them, and appealed to it so confidently, as a corroboration of his predictions, and a great advance towards the realization of the romantic legend of Lovely Peg, that he bewildered the old man Walter for his part feigned to be so full of hope and ardor, and so sure of coming home again soon, and backed up the captain with such expressive shaking of his head and rubbings of his hands that Solomon, looking first at him, that at Captain Cuttle began to think he ought to be transported with joy. "But I'm behind the time, you understand," he observed in apology, passing his hand nervously down the whole row of bright buttons on his coat, and then up again as if they were beads, and he were telling them twice over. "And I would rather have my dear boy here. It's an old-fashioned notion, I dare say. He was always fond of the sea, he's—" and he looked wistfully at Walter. "He's glad to go, Uncle Sol," cried Walter quickly. "If you say that, I won't go. No, Captain Cuttle, I won't. If my uncle thinks I could be glad to leave him, though I was going to be made governor of all the islands in the West Indies. That's enough. I'm a fixture, Waller, my lad," said the captain. "Steady, Sol Gills. Take an observation of your nevy," following with his eyes the majestic action of the captain's hook. "The old man looked at Walter. Here is a certain craft," said the captain, with a magnificent sense of the allegory into which he was soaring, going to put out on a certain voyage. "What name is wrought upon that craft indelibly? Is it the Gay, or," said the captain, raising his voice as much as to say, "Observe the point of this. Is it the Gills, Ned?" said the old man, drawing Walter to his side and taking his arm tenderly through his. I know, of course, I know that Wally considers me more than himself always. That's in my mind. When I say he is glad to go, I mean I hope he is. Look, you Ned, and you to Wally, my dear, this is new and unexpected to me, and I'm afraid my being behind the time and poor is at the bottom of it. Is it really good fortune for him, do you tell me now?" said the old man, looking anxiously from one to the other. "Really and truly is it. I can reconcile myself to almost anything that advances Wally, but I won't have Wally putting himself at any disadvantage for me or keeping anything from me, you Ned Cuttle," said the old man, fastening on the captain, to the manifest confusion of that diplomatist. "Are you dealing plainly by your old friend? Speak out, Ned Cuttle. Is there anything behind Orty to go? How do you know it first, and why?" As it was a contest of affection and self-denial, Walter struck in with infinite effect, to the captain's relief, and between them they tolerably reconciled old Sol Gills by continued talking to the project, or rather so confused him that nothing, not even the pain of separation, was distinctly clear to his mind. He had not much time to balance the matter, for on the very next day Walter received from Mr. Parker, the manager, the necessary credentials for his passage and outfit, together with the information that the Son and Heir would sail in a fortnight, or within a day or two afterwards at latest. In the hurry of preparation, which Walter purposely enhanced as much as possible, the old man lost what little self-possession he ever had, and so the time of departure drew on rapidly. The captain, who did not fail to make himself acquainted with all that passed through inquiries of Walter from day to day, found the time still tending on towards his going away, without any occasion offering itself or seeming likely to offer itself for a better understanding of his position. It was after much consideration of this fact, and much pondering over such unfortunate combination of circumstances, that a bright idea occurred to the captain. Suppose he made a call on Mr. Parker and tried to find out from him how the and really lay. Captain Cuttle liked this idea very much. It came upon him in a moment of inspiration, as he was smoking an early pipe in Brig Place after breakfast, and it was worthy of the tobacco. It would quiet his conscience, which was an honest one, and was made a little uneasy by what Walter had confided to him and what Sol Gills had said, and it would be a deep, shrewd act of friendship. He would sound Mr. Parker carefully, and say much or little, just as he read that gentleman's character, and discovered that they got on well together, or the reverse accordingly, without the fear of Walter before his eyes, who he knew was at home packing. Captain Cuttle again assumed his ankle jacks and mourning brooch, and issued forth on the second expedition. He purchased no propitiatory nosegay on the present occasion, as he was going to a place of business, but he put a small sunflower in his buttonhole to give himself an agreeable relish of the country, and with this, and the knobby stick, and the glazed hat, bore down upon the offices of Danby and Son, after taking a glass of warm rum and water at a tavern close by to collect his thoughts. The captain made a rush down the court, lest its good effect should evaporate, and appeared suddenly to Mr. Perch. Matey, said the captain in persuasive accents, one of your governors is named Cocker. Mr. Perch admitted it, but gave him to understand as in official duty bound that all his governors were engaged and never expected to be disengaged any more. Lucky you, mate, said the captain in his ear. My name's Captain Cuddle. The captain would have hooked Perch gently to him, but Mr. Perch eluded the attempt, not so much in design as in starting at the sudden thought that such a weapon unexpectedly exhibited to Mrs. Perch might in her then condition be destructive to that lady's hopes. If you will be so good as just report Captain Cuttlefish when you get a chance, said the captain. I'll wait, saying which the captain took his seat on Mr. Percher's bracket and drawing out his handkerchief from the crown of the glazed hat which he jammed between his knees without injury to its shape, for nothing human could bend it, rubbed his head well all over and appeared refreshed. He subsequently arranged his hair with his hook and sat looking round the office, contemplating the clerks with a serene respect. The captain's equanimity was so impenetrable, and he was altogether so mysterious a being, that Perch the messenger was daunted. What name was it you said? asked Mr. Perch, bending down over him as he sat on the bracket cabin in a deep hoarse whisper. Yes, said Mr. Perch, keeping time with his head. Cuddle. Oh, said Mr. Perch in the same tone, for he caught it and couldn't help it. The captain in his diplomacy was so impressive. I'll see if he's disengaged now. I don't know, perhaps he may be for a minute. Aye, my lad, I won't detain him longer than a minute, said the captain, nodding with all the weighty importance that he felt within him. Perch soon returning said, will Captain Cuddle walk this way? Mr. Parker, the manager, standing on the hearth rug before the empty fireplace, which was ornamented with a castellated sheet of brown paper, looked at the captain as he came in with no very special encouragement. Mr. Carker, said Captain Cuddle. I believe, sir, said Mr. Carker, showing all his teeth. The captain liked his arm swing with a smile. It looked pleasant, you see, began the captain, rolling his eyes slowly round the little room and taking in as much of it as his shirt collar permitted. I'm a seafaring man myself, Mr. Carker, and Walter, as he's on your books here, is almost a son of mine. Walter Gay, said Mr. Carker, showing all of his teeth again. Waller K. It is, replied the captain. Right. The captain's manner expressed a warm approval of Mr. Parker's quickness of perception. I'm an intimate friend of his and his uncle's, perhaps, said the captain. You may have heard your head governor mention my name. Captain Cuddle. Nah, said Mr. Parker with a still wider demonstration than before. Well, resumed the captain, I've the pleasure of his acquaintance. I waited upon him down on the Sussex coast there with my young friend Walter, when in short, when there was a little accommodation wanted. The captain nodded his head in a manner that was at once comfortable, easy, and expressive. You remember, I dare say. I think, said Mr. Cocker, I had the honor of arranging the business. To be sure, returned the captain. Right again, you add. Now I've took the liberty of coming here. Won't you sit down, said Mr. Parker, smiling. Thank you, returned the captain, availing himself of the author. A man does get more way upon himself, perhaps, in his conversation when he sits down. Won't you take a cheer yourself? No, thank you, said the manager, standing perhaps from the force of winter habit with his back against the chimney piece and looking down upon the captive with an eye in every tooth and gum. You have taken the liberty, you are going to say, though it's none. Thank you kindly, my lad, returned the captain, of coming here on account of my friend Wildersall Gills. His uncle is a man of science, and in science he may be considered a clipper, but he ain't what I should altogether call a able seaman, not a man of practice. Waller is as trim as ever stepped, but he's a little down by the head in one respect, and that is modesty. Know what I should wish to put to you, said the captain, lowering his voice and speaking in a kind of confidential growl, in a friendly way, entirely between you and me and for my own private reckoning, till your Ed governor has worn round a bit and I can come alongside of him. Is everything right and comfortable here? And is water outward bound with a pretty fair wind? What do you think now? Captain Cuddle returned, Cocker, gathering up his skirts and settling himself in his position. You are a practical man. What do you think? The acuteness and the significance of the captain's eye as he cocked it in reply. No words short of those unutterable Chinese words before referred to could describe. Come, said the captain, unspeakably encouraged. What do you say? Am I right or wrong? So much had the captain expressed in his eye, emboldened and incited by Mr. Parker's smiling urbanity, that he felt himself in as fair a condition to put the question as if he had expressed his sentiments with the utmost elaboration. "Right," said Mr. Cocker. "I have no doubt outed bound with fair weather, then I say," cried Captain Cuttle. Mr. Caraca smiled assent. "Wind right astern." "And plenty of it," pursued the captain. Mr. Cocker smiled assent again. I said Captain Cuttle, greatly relieved and pleased. "I know how she had it well enough, I told Waller, so thank the gay has brilliant prospects," observed Mr. Cocker, stretching his mouth wider. "Yet all the world before him, all the world, and his wife too, as the saying is," returned the delighted captain. At the word wife, which he had uttered without design, the captain stopped, cocked his eye again, and putting the glazed head on the top of his knobby stick, gave it a twirl and looked sideways at his always smiling friend. "I'd bet a Jill of old Jamaica," said the captain, eyeing him attentively, "that I know what you're smiling at." Mr. Parker took his cue and smiled the more. "It goes no farther," said the captain, making a poke at the door with a knobstick to assure himself that it was shut. "Not an inch," said Mr. Parker. "You're thinking of a capital F perhaps," said the captain. Mr. Parker didn't deny it. "Anything about AL," said the captain. "Or a O." Mr. Parker still smiled. "Am I right again?" inquired the captain in a whisper, with the scarlet circle on his forehead swelling in his triumphant joy. Mr. Parker in reply still smiling and now nodding assent. Captain Cuttle rose and squeezed him by the hand, assuring him warmly that they were on the same tack, and that as for him, Cuttle, he had laid his course that way all along. "He noted her first," said the captain, with all the secrecy and gravity that the subject demanded, in an uncommon manner. "You remember his finding her in the street when she was almost a baby. He has liked her ever since, and she him as much as to youngsters. We've always said, Sol Gills and me, that they was cut out for each other. A cat or a monkey or a hyena or a death's head could not have shown the captain more teeth at one time than Mr. Parker showed him at this period of their interview. There's a general in draft that way," observed the happy captain. "Wind and water sets in that direction. You see, look at his being present other day most favorable to his hopes," said Mr. Parker. "Look at his being towed along in the wake of that day," pursued the captain. "Why, what can cut him adrift now?" "Nothing," replied Mr. Parker. "You're right again," returned the captain, giving his hand another squeeze. "Nothing, it is so steady. There is a sun gone. Pretty little critter, ain't there?" "Yes, there is a sun gone," said the acquiescent Parker. "Pass the word, and has another ready for you," quoth the captain. "Never you were scientific Uncle Navy of old Sol Gills Waller, as is already in your business," and said the captain, rising gradually to a quotation he was preparing for the final burst. "Who comes from Sol Gills daily to your business and your bosoms." The captain's complacency, as he gently jogged Mr. Parker with his elbow on concluding each of the foregoing short sentences, could be surpassed by nothing but the exultation with which he fell back and eyed him when he had finished this brilliant display of eloquence and sagacity, his great blue waistcoat heaving with the throes of such a masterpiece, and his nose in a state of violent inflammation from the same cause. "Am I right?" said the captain. "Captain Cattle," said Mr. Parker, bending down at the knees for a moment in an odd manner, as if he were falling together to hug the whole of himself at once. "Your views in reference to Walter Gay are thoroughly and accurately right. I understand that we speak together in confidence." "Honor," interposed the captain. "Not a word to him or anyone," pursued the manager. Captain Cuttle frowned and shook his head. "But merely for your own satisfaction and guidance." "And guidance, of course," repeated Mr. Parker, "with a view to your future proceeding." "Thank the kindly, I am sure," said the captain, listening with great attention. "I have no hesitation in saying that's the fact. You have hit the probabilities exactly, and with regard to your head governor," said the captain, "why, an interview would better come about natural between us. There's time enough." Mr. Parker, with his mouth familiar to ear, repeated time enough, not articulating the words, but bowing his head affably and forming them with his tongue and lips. "And as I know, it's what I always said, that Waller is in a way to make his fortune," said the captain. "To make his fortune," Mr. Parker repeated in the same dumb manner. "And as Waller is going on this little voyage, as I may say, in his day's work and a part of his general expectations here," said the captain. "Of his general expectations here," assented Mr. Cocker dumbly as before. "Why, so long as I know that," pursued the captain, "there's no hurry, and my mind's at ease." Mr. Parker still blandly assenting in the same voiceless manner. Captain Cuttle was strongly confirmed in his opinion that he was one of the most agreeable men he had ever met, and that even Mr. Dombey might improve himself on such a model with great heartiness. Therefore the captain once again extended his enormous hand, not unlike an old block in color, and gave him a grip that left upon his smoother flesh a proof impression of the chinks and crevices with which the captain's palm was liberally tattooed. "Farewell," said the captain. "I ain't a man of many words, but I take it very kind of you to be so friendly and above board. You'll excuse me if I've been at all an intrusion, will you?" said the captain. "Not at all," returned the other. "Thank you. My berth ain't very roomy," said the captain, turning back again, "but it's tolerably snug. And if you wish to find yourself near a brig, place No. 9 at any time, will you make a note of it, and would come upstairs without minding what was said by the person at the door. I should be proud to see you." With that hospitable invitation, the captain said good day and walked out and shut the door, leaving Mr. Cocker still reclining against the chimney piece, in whose sly look and watchful manner, in whose false mouth stretched, but not laughing, in whose spotless cravat and very whiskers, even in whose silent passing of his soft hand over his white linen and his smooth face, there was something desperately cat-like. The unconscious captain walked out in a state of self-glorification that imparted quite a new cut to the broad blue suit. "Stand, boy, Ned," said the captain to himself. "You've done a little business for the youngsters today, my lad." In his exultation and in his familiarity, present and perspective with the house, the captain, when he reached the outer office, could not refrain from rallying Mr. Perch a little and asking him whether he thought everybody was still engaged, but not to be better, on a man who had done his duty. The captain whispered in his ear that if he felt disposed for a glass of rum and water and would follow, he would be happy to bestow the same upon him before leaving the premises. The captain, somewhat to the astonishment of the clerks, looked round from a central point of view and took a general survey of the office as part and parcel of a project in which his young friend was nearly interested. The strong room excited his especial admiration, but that he might not appear to particular, he limited himself to an approving glance, and with a graceful recognition of the clerks as a body that was full of politeness and patronage, passed out into the court. Being promptly joined by Mr. Perch, he conveyed that gentleman to the tavern and fulfilled his pledge hastily, for Perch's time was precious. "I'll give you for a toast," said the captain. "Waller," who submitted. Mr. Perch. "Waller," repeated the captain in a voice of thunder. Mr. Perch, who seemed to remember having heard in infancy that there was once a poet of that name, made no objection, but he was much astonished at the captain's coming into the city to propose a poet. Indeed, if he had proposed to put a poet's statue up, say Shakespeare's, for example, in a civic thoroughfare, he could hardly have done a greater outrage to Mr. Percy's experience. On the whole, he was such a mysterious and incomprehensible character that Mr. Perch decided not to mention him to Mrs. Perch at all, in case of giving rise to any disagreeable consequences. Mysterious and incomprehensible, the captain, with that lively sense upon him of having done a little business for the youngsters, remained all day, even to his most intimate friends, and but that Walter attributed his winks and grins and other such pantomimic reliefs of himself to his satisfaction in the success of their innocent deception upon old Sol Gills, he would assuredly have betrayed himself before night. As it was, however, he kept his own secret and went home late from the instrument maker's house, wearing the glazed hat so much on one side and carrying such a beaming expression in his eyes that Mrs. McStinger, who might have been brought up a Dr. Blimber, she was such a Roman matron, fortified herself at the first glimpse of him behind the open street door, and refused to come out to the contemplation of her blessed infants until he was securely lodged in his own room. Chapter 18. Father and daughter. There is a hush through Mr. Dumpy's house. Servants gliding up and downstairs rustle, but make no sound of footsteps. They talk together constantly and sit long at meals, making much of their meat and drink and enjoying themselves after a grim, unholy fashion. Mrs. Wickham, with her eyes suffused with tears, relates melancholy anecdotes and tells them how she always said at Mrs. Pipchin's that it would be so, and takes more table ill than usual, and is very sorry, but sociable cook's state of mind is similar. She promises a little fry for supper and struggles about equally against her feelings, and the onions. Townsend begins to think there's a fate in it and wants to know if anybody can tell him of any good that ever came of living in a Corner house it seems to all of them as having happened a long time ago, though yet the child lies calm and beautiful upon his little bed after dark. There come some visitors, noiseless visitors, with shoes of felt who have been there before, and with them comes that bed of rest which is so strange a one for infant sleepers. All this time, the bereaved father has not been seen even by his attendant, for he sits in an inner corner of his own dark room when anyone is there and never seems to move at other times except to pace it to and fro. But in the morning it is whispered among the household that he was heard to go upstairs in the dead night, and that he stayed there in the room until the sun was shining at the offices in the city. The ground glass windows are made more dim by shutters, and while the lighted lamps upon the desks are half extinguished by the day that wanders in the day is half extinguished by the lamps, and an unusual gloom prevails, there is not much business done. The clerks are indisposed to work, and they make assignations to eat chops in the afternoon and go up the river perch. The messenger stays long upon his errands, and finds himself in bars of public houses, invited thither by friends, and holding forth on the uncertainty of human affairs. He goes home to Ball's Pond earlier in the evening than usual, and treats Mrs. Perch to a veal cutlet and Scotch ale. Mr. Parker, the manager, treats no one, neither is he treated, but alone in his own room. He shows his teeth all day, and it would seem that there is something gone from Mr. Parker's path, some obstacle removed which clears his way before him. Now the rosy children living opposite to Mr. Dobby's house peep from their nursery windows down into the street, for there are 4 black horses at his door, with feathers on their heads, and feathers tremble on the carriage that they draw, and these and an array of men with scarves and staves attract to crowd the juggler, who was going to twirl the basin, put his loose coat on again over his fine dress, and his trudging wife one-sided, with her heavy baby in her arms, looters to see the company come out. But closer to her dingy breast she presses her baby, when the burden that is so easily carried is borne forth, and the youngest of the rosy children, at the high window opposite, needs no restraining hand to check her in her glee, when pointing with her dimpled finger she looks into her nurse's face and asks, "What's that?" And now among the knot of servants dressed in mourning and the weeping women, Mr. Dombey passes through the hall to the other carriage that is waiting to receive him. He is not brought down, these observers think, by sorrow and distress of mind. His walk is as erect, his bearing is as stiff as ever it has been. He hides his face behind no handkerchief and looks before him, but that his face is something sunk and rigid, and as pale it bears the same expression as of old. He takes his place within the carriage, and 3 other gentlemen follow. Then the grand funeral moves slowly down the street. The feathers are yet nodding in the distance, when the juggler has the basin spinning on a cane, and has the same crowd to admire it. But the juggler's wife is less alert than usual with the money box for a child's burial, has set her thinking that perhaps the baby underneath her shabby shawl may not grow up to be a man, and wear a sky-blue fillet round his head and salmon-colored woolen drawers, and tumble in the mud. The feathers wind their gloomy way along the streets, and come within the sound of a church bell. In the same church the pretty boy received all that will soon be left of him on earth, a name all of him that is dead. They lay there near the perishable substance of his mother. It is well their ashes lie where Florence in her walks, a lonely, lonely walks, may pass them any day. The service over, and the clergyman withdrawn, Mr. Dombey looks round, demanding in a low voice whether the person who has been requested to attend to receive instructions for the tablet is there. Someone comes forward and says yes. Mr. Dombey intimates where he would have it placed, and shows him with his hand upon the wall the shape and size, and how it is to follow the memorial to the mother. Then with his pencil he writes out the inscription, and gives it to him, adding, "I wish to have it done at once." "It shall be done immediately, sir. There is really nothing to inscribe but name and age." You see the man bows, glancing at the paper, but appears to hesitate. Mr. Dombey, not observing his hesitation, turns away and leads towards the porch. I beg your pardon, sir." A touch falls gently on his morning cloak. "But as you wish it done immediately, and it may be put in hand when I get back, well, will you be so good as to read it over again? I think there's a mistake where the statuary." Gives him back the paper and points out with his pocket rule the words "beloved" and "only child." "It should be son." "I think so. You are right, of course. make the correction, the father with a hasty step pursues his way to the coach. When the other three who follow closely take their seats, his face is hidden, for the first time shaded by his cloak, nor do they see it any more that day. He alights first and passes immediately into his own room. The other mourners, who were only Mr. Check and two of the medical attendants, proceed upstairs to the drawing room to be received by Mrs. Check and Miss Tox. And what the face is in the shut-up chamber underneath, or what the thoughts are, what the heart is, what the contest or the suffering, no one knows. The chief thing that they know below stairs in the kitchen is that it seems like Sunday. They can hardly persuade themselves, but there is something unbecoming, if not wicked, in the conduct of the people out of doors who pursue their ordinary occupations and wear their everyday attire. It is quite a novelty to have the blinds up and the shutters open, and they make themselves dismally comfortable over bottles of wine, which are freely broached as on a festival. They are much inclined to moralize. Mr. Tallinson proposes with a sigh amendment to us all, for which his cook says with another sigh, there's room enough, God knows. In the evening, Mrs. Chick and Miss Tox take to needlework again. In the evening also Mr. Tallinson goes out to take the air, accompanied by the housemaid, who has not yet tried her morning bonnet. They are very tender to each other at dusky street corners, and Tallinson has visions of leading an altered and blameless existence. As a serious greengrocer in Oxford Market, there is a sound asleep and deeper rest in Mr. Dombey's house tonight than there has been for many nights. The morning sun awakens the old household, settle down once more in their old ways. The rosy children opposite run past with hoops. There is a splendid wedding in the church. The juggler's wife is active with the money box in another quarter of the town. The mason sings and whistles as he chips out PAUL in the marble slab before him. And can it be that in a world so full and busy, the loss of one weak creature makes a void in any heart so wide and deep that nothing but the width and depth of vast eternity can fill it up? Florence, in her innocent affliction, might have answered, "O my brother, O my dearly loved and loving brother, only friend and companion of my slighted childhood, could any less idea shed the light already dawning on your early grave, or give birth to the softened sorrow that is springing into life beneath this reign of tears?" "My dear child," said Mrs. Chick, who held it as a duty incumbent on her to improve the occasion, "when you are as old as I am, which will be the prime of life," observed Miss Tox, "you will then," pursued Mrs. Check, gently squeezing Miss Tox's hand in acknowledgement of her friendly remark, "you will then know that all grief is unavailing, and that it is our duty to submit." "I will try, dear aunt, I do try," answered Florence, sobbing. "I am glad to hear it," said Mrs. Chick, "because my love, as our dear Miss Tox, of whose sound sense and excellent judgment there cannot possibly be two opinions, my dear Louisa, I should really be proud soon," said Miss Tox. "Will tell you and confirm by her experience," pursued Mrs. Chick. "We are called upon on all occasions to make an effort. It is required of us, if any, my dear," turning to Miss Tox. "I want a word, misdemeanor," suggested Miss Tox. No, said Mrs. Check. "How can you? Goodness me, it's on the end of my tongue." Misplaced affection," suggested Miss Tox timidly. "Good gracious, Lucretia," returned Mrs. Chick, "how very monstrous. Misanthrope is the word I want. The idea misplaced affection, I say. If any misanthrope were to put in my presence the question, 'Why were we born?' I should reply, 'To make an effort.'" "Very good indeed," said Miss Tox, much impressed by the originality of the sentiment. "Very good. Unhappily," pursued Mrs. Chick, "we have a warning under our own eyes. We have but too much reason to suppose, my dear child, that if an effort had been made in time, in this family a train of the most trying and distressing circumstances might have been avoided." "Nothing shall ever persuade me," observed the good matron with a resolute air, "but that if that effort had been made by poor dear Fanny, the poor dear darling child would at least have had a stronger constitution." Mrs. Chick abandoned herself to her feelings for half a moment, but as a practical illustration of her doctrine, brought herself up short in the middle of a sob, and went on again. "Therefore, Florence, pray let us see that you have some strength of mind, and do not selfishly aggravate the distress in which your poor papa is plunged." "Dear aunt," said Florence, kneeling quickly down before her, that she might the better and more earnestly look into her face, "tell me more about Papa. Pray tell me about him. Is he quite heartbroken?" Miss Tox was of a tender nature, and there was something in this appeal that moved her very much, whether she saw it in a succession on the part of the neglected child, to the affectionate concern, so often expressed by her dead brother, or a love that sought to twine itself about the heart that had loved him, and that could not bear to be shut out from sympathy with such a sorrow and such sad community of love and grief, or whether she only recognized the earnest and devoted spirit which, although discarded and repulsed, was wrung with tenderness long unreturned, and in the waste and solitude of this bereavement cried to him to seek a comfort in it, and to give some small response. Whatever may have been her understanding of it, it moved Miss Stokes. For the moment she forgot the majesty of Mrs. Chick, and patting Florence hastily on the cheek, turned aside and suffered the tears to gush from her eyes without waiting for a lead from that wise matron. Mrs. Chick herself lost for a moment the presence of mind on which she so much prided herself, and remained mute, looking on the beautiful young face that had so long, so steadily and patiently been turned towards the little bed, but recovering her voice, which was synonymous with her presence of mind. Indeed, they were one and the same thing. She replied with dignity, "Florence, my dear child, your poor papa is peculiar at times, and to question me about him is to question me upon a subject which I really do not pretend to understand. I believe I have as much influence with your papa as anybody has. Still, all I can say is that he has said very little to me, and that I have only seen him once or twice for a minute at a time, and indeed have hardly seen him then, for his room has been dark. I have said to your papa, Paul, that is the exact expression I used, Paul, why do you not take something stimulating? Your papa's reply has always been, Louisa, have the goodness to leave me. I want nothing. I am better by myself. If I was to be put upon my oath tomorrow, Lucretia, before a magistrate, said Mrs. C.K., I have no doubt I could venture to swear to those identical words. Miss Stokes expressed her admiration by saying, my Louisa is ever methodical. In short, Florence, resumed her aunt, literally nothing has passed between your poor papa and myself until today, when I mentioned to your papa that Sir Barnet and Lady Skettles had written exceedingly kind notes. Our sweet boy Lady Skettles loved him like a where's my pocket handkerchief. Miss Stokes produced one exceedingly kind notes, proposing that you should visit them for a change of scene, mentioning to your papa that I thought Miss Stokes and myself might now go home, in which he quite agreed. I inquired if he had any objection to your accepting this invitation. He said no, Louisa, not the least. Florence raised her tearful eye. At the same time, if you prefer staying here, Florence, to paying this visit at present, or to going home with me, I should prefer it, aunt, was the faint rejoinder. Why then, child, said Mrs. Chick, you can, it's a strange choice, I must say, but you always were strange anybody else at your time of life. And after what has passed, my dear Miss Stokes, have lost my pocket handkerchief again, would be glad to leave here. One would suppose I should not like to feel, said Florence, as if the house was avoided. I should not like to think that the room upstairs were quite empty and dreary. Art, I would rather stay here for the present. Oh my brother, oh my brother. It was a natural emotion, not to be suppressed, and it would make way even between the fingers of the hands with which he covered up her face. The overcharged and heavy-laden breast must sometimes have that vent, or the poor wounded solitary heart within it would have fluttered like a bird with broken wings and sunk down in the dust. Well, child, said Mrs. Chick, after a pause, I wouldn't on any account say anything unkind to you, and that I'm sure you know. You will remain here then, and do exactly as you like. No one will interfere with you, Florence, or wish to interfere with you, I am sure. Florence shook her head in sad assent. I had no sooner begun to advise your poor papa that he really ought to seek some distraction and restoration in a temporary change, said Mrs. Chick, than he told me he had already formed the intention of going into the country for a short time. I'm sure I hope he'll go very soon. He can't go too soon, but I suppose there are some arrangements connected with his private papers and so forth consequent on the affliction that has tried us all so much. I can't think what's become of him. Lucretia, lend me yours, my dear, that may occupy him for 1 or 2 evenings in his own room. Your papa's a dumb child, if ever there was one, said Mrs. Chick, drying both her eyes at once with great care on opposite corners of Mrs. Stokes' handkerchief. You'll make an effort, there's no fear of him, is there? Nothing, aunt, said Florence, trembling. I might do to Lord, my dear child, interposed Mrs. Chick hastily. What are you talking about? If your papa said to me, I have given you his exact words, Louisa, I want nothing. I am better by myself. What do you think he'd say to you? You mustn't show yourself to him, child. Don't dream of such a thing, Aunt, said Florence. I will go and lie down on my bed. Mrs. Cuckwell approved of this resolution and dismissed her with a kiss, but Miss Tokes, on a faint pretense of looking for the mislaid handkerchief, went upstairs after her and tried in a few stolen minutes to comfort her in spite of great discouragement from Susan Nipper for Miss Nipper in her burning zeal disparaged Miss Tokes as a crocodile, yet her sympathy seemed genuine, and at least the vantage ground of disinterestedness. There was little favor to be won by it, and was there no one nearer and dearer than Susan to uphold the striving heart? In its anguish was there no other neck to clasp, no other face to turn, to no one else to say a soothing word to such deep sorrow? Was Florence so alone in the bleak world that nothing else remained to her, nothing, stricken motherless and brotherless at once? For in the loss of little Paul, that first and greatest loss fell heavily upon her. This was the only help she had. Oh, who can tell how much she needed help at first, when the house subsided into its accustomed course, and they had all gone away except the servants, and her father shut up in his own rooms. Florence could do nothing but weep and wander up and down, and sometimes, in a sudden pang of desolate remembrance, fly to her own chamber, wring her hands, lay her face down on her bed, and know no consolation, nothing but the bitterness and cruelty of grief. This commonly ensued upon the recognition of some spot or object very tenderly dated with him, and it made the miserable house at first a place of agony. But it is not in the nature of pure love to burn so fiercely and unkindly long the flame, that in its grosser composition has the taint of earth may prey upon the breast that gives it shelter. But the fire from heaven is as gentle in the heart as when it rested on the heads of the assembled 12, and showed each man his brother brightened, and unhurt the image conjured up there soon returned the placid face, the softened voice, the loving looks, the quiet trustfulness and peace. And Florence, though she wept, still wept more tranquilly and courted the remembrance. It was not very long before the golden water dancing on the wall in the old place, at the old serene time, had her karma fixed upon it as it ebbed away. It was not very long before that room again knew her, often sitting there alone, as patient and as mild as when she had watched beside the little bed. When any sharp sense of its being empty smote upon her, she could kneel beside it and pray God it was the pouring out of her full heart to let one angel love her and remember her. It was not very long before, in the midst of the dismal house so wide and dreary, her low voice in the twilight slowly and stopping sometimes touched the old air to which he had so often listened, with his drooping head upon her arm. And after that, and when it was quite dark, a little strain of music trembled in the room, so softly played and sung that it was more like the mournful recollection of what she had done at his request on that last night than the reality repeated. But it was repeated often, very often, in the shadowy solitude, and broken murmurs of the strain still trembled on the keys when the sweet voice was hushed in tears. Thus she gained heart to look upon the work with which her fingers had been busy by his side on the seashore, and thus it was not very long before she took to it again with something of a human love for it, as if it had been sentient and had known him, and sitting in a window near her mother's picture in the unused room, so long deserted, wore away the thoughtful hours. Why did the dark eyes turn so often from this work to where the rosy children lived? They were not immediately suggestive of her loss, for they were all girls, for little sisters, but they were motherless like her, and had a father it was easy to know when he had gone out and was expected home, for the elder child was always dressed and waiting for him at the drawing-room window or in the balcony, and when he appeared, her expectant face lighted up with joy, while the others at the high window, and always on the watch to clap their hands and drum them on the sill and called to him, the elder child would come down to the hall and put her hand in his and lead him up the stairs, and Florence would see her afterwards sitting by his side or on his knee, or hanging coaxingly about his neck and talking to him. And though they were always gay together, he would often watch her face as if he thought her like her mother that was dead. Florence would sometimes look no more at this, and bursting into tears would hide behind the curtain as if she were frightened, or would hurry from the window. Yet she could not help returning, and her work would soon fall unheeded from her hands again. It was the house that had been empty years ago. It had remained so for a long time at last, and while she had been away from home, this family had taken it, and it was repaired and newly painted, and there were birds and flowers about it, and it looked very different from its old self. But she never thought of the house, the children, and their father were all in all when he had dined. She could see them through the open windows go down with their governess or nurse and cluster round the table, and in the still summer weather the sound of their childish voices and clear laughter would come ringing across the street into the drooping air of the room in which she sat. Then they would climb and clambered upstairs with him and romp about him on the sofa, all grouped themselves at his knee, a very nose-gave little faces, while he seemed to tell them some story. Or they would come running out into the balcony, and then Florence would hide herself quickly lest it should check them in their joy to see her in her black dress sitting there alone. The elder child remained with her father when the rest had gone away, and made his tea for him. Happy little housekeeper she was then, and sat conversing with him, sometimes at the window, sometimes in the room, until the candles came. He made her his companion, though she was some years younger than Florence, and she could be as staid and pleasantly demure with her little book or workbox as a woman. When they had candles, Florence from her own dark room was not afraid to look again. But when the time came for the child to say good night, Papa, and go to bed, Florence would sob and tremble as she raised her face to him and could look no more, though still she would turn again and again before going to bed herself from the simple air that had lulled him to rest so often long ago, and from the other low, soft, broken strain of music back to that house. But that she ever thought of it or watched it was a secret which she kept within her own young breast. And did that breast of Florence so ingenuous and true, so worthy of the love that he had borne her, and had whispered in his last faint words, whose guileless heart was mirrored in the beauty of her face and breathed in every accent of her gentle voice. Did that young breast hold any other secret?